Min-jae Park's gold pen froze mid-signature as the boardroom erupted in camera flashes. The contract for the Itaewon demolition sat before him. 37 buildings, 400 families, signed away with a stroke that would net his company 2 billion won. But through the floor-to-ceiling windows, he could see her, the black woman from the community kitchen, who'd been haunting his thoughts for weeks, now standing in his lobby 3 floors below, holding a megaphone and a petition with 1,000 signatures. "Mr. Park!" A reporter shoved a microphone toward his face. "Ms. Harrington claims your Harmony Heights project will destroy Seoul's most diverse neighborhood. How do you respond?" The irony wasn't lost on him. Harmony Heights, a name chosen by marketing to soften the blow of displacement. Down below, Simone Harrington's voice echoed through the marble atrium. "This man signs death warrants for communities while calling it progress." Director Choi leaned forward, his gold watch catching the light. "Sir, we need your signature now. The media won't wait, and neither will our investors." Min-jae's hand trembled, not from nerves, but from a sensation he'd thought lost forever. For the first time in 3 years, since his ajuzia had stolen every flavor from his world, he could taste something. Salt. His own tears. The elevator dinged. Security was escorting Simone up, not to arrest her, but because she'd demanded to look him in the eye before he destroyed her world. If you've ever wondered what happens when a man who's lost the ability to taste anything meets a woman whose cooking feeds an entire community's soul, and what it costs when love collides with empire, then stay with us. Subscribe and hit that notification bell, because this story of hunger, healing, and the price of redemption is just beginning to simmer. Trust us. You won't want to miss what happens when Simone Harrington walks through that boardroom door. The 52nd birthday cake sat untouched, its vanilla layers mocking Min-jae Park from across his Gangnam penthouse. 3 tiers of imported Swiss chocolate, crafted by Seoul's most expensive pâtissier, might as well have been cardboard. He pressed his fork through the frosting. Smooth texture, sweet scent that meant nothing, flavor that registered as mere temperature and weight on his tongue. "Sir?" Mrs. Kim set down another glass of the Dom Perignon his guests had been toasting with. "The mayor is asking about your speech." Min-jae nodded, straightening his navy Armani tie. 43 guests filled his marble-floored apartment. Politicians, fellow chaebol heirs, entertainment moguls, all celebrating his latest acquisition of prime Itaewon real estate. Their conversations echoed off the walls like hollow percussion. "Ladies and gentlemen," Min-jae tapped his champagne flute, though he couldn't taste the bubbles that cost more per bottle than most Seoul families spent on groceries in a month. "Thank you for celebrating another year of life and another step toward transforming Seoul's landscape." Applause rippled through the room. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, the city sprawled below. A chessboard of opportunity where every move displaced someone else's dreams. "The Harmony Heights project represents more than development," Min-jae continued, his voice carrying the practiced authority of 3 generations of Park family wealth. "It's about elevating communities, bringing progress to—" His phone buzzed with a news alert. Community kitchen serves final meals before demolition. The accompanying photo showed a black woman ladling soup into bowls held by elderly Korean hands, children clutching homemade bread, families sharing tables made from repurposed doors. Simone Harrington. He'd studied her file obsessively since the protests began. 44 years old, divorced, trained at Johnson & Wales before opening her bistro in Itaewon's multicultural heart. Her community kitchen had fed over 300 families weekly during the pandemic, operating on donations and sheer determination. "Sir?" Director Choi appeared at his elbow, designer glasses reflecting the chandelier light. "The construction permits are ready for your signature. We can break ground Monday if we move fast." Min-jae's chest tightened. 3 years ago, before the ajuzia stole his ability to taste anything beyond bitter, sweet, sour, salty, and umami. Before even those became mere mechanical sensations, he might have felt something. Guilt, perhaps. Remorse. Now, only the ghost of emotions remained, as flavorless as everything else. "Monday seems rushed," Mrs. Kim interjected, her maternal instinct sensing his hesitation. Perhaps we should review. Monday is perfect, Choi interrupted, his tone respectfully firm. The community's legal challenges are weakening. Any delay gives them more ammunition. The news alert refreshed. Local chef confronts development giant. He's never tasted hunger. Those words hit deeper than they should have. Simone Harrington had no idea how literally accurate she was. Min-jae hadn't truly tasted anything in 3 years. Not since the burnout that followed his father's death, the crushing responsibility of inheriting Park Industries, the gradual realization that all the money in Korea couldn't buy back his mother's laughter or his father's approval. The adjusia had arrived quietly, like most profound losses. First, wine became water. Then his favorite bulgogi tasted like salted cardboard. Finally, even tears lost their flavor, leaving him a man who owned everything but could savor nothing. Ladies and gentlemen, Mayor Kim raised his glass for another toast. To Min-jae Park, a visionary who transforms not just buildings, but lives. More applause, more hollow celebration. Min-jae smiled and nodded, playing his role in the theater of success while staring at Simone Harrington's photo. Her hands were stained with turmeric and hope, her smile genuine in a way that no amount of money could manufacture. She was creating something while he destroyed, nourishing while he emptied. The party wound down past midnight, guests departing in their imported cars toward houses that cost more than small countries' GDP. Min-jae stood alone on his balcony, the October wind cutting through his dress shirt, Seoul's lights blinking like fallen stars. His phone rang. Mrs. Kim's name appeared on the screen. She never called this late, unless something was wrong. Sir, there's been a development. Ms. Harrington has called a press conference for tomorrow morning. She's obtained the original architectural surveys for the Itaewon site. Mrs. Kim's voice carried the weight of 15 years managing Park Industries' public relations crises. Sir, there may be historical significance to some of those buildings. If she can prove cultural heritage value, she can't stop progress with sentimentality, Min-jae interrupted, though his conviction felt hollow even to himself. The contracts are ironclad. The permits are approved. The demolition happens Monday. Sir, with respect, sometimes even ironclad contracts can be bent by public pressure. Your father always said, "My father isn't here." The words came out sharper than intended. Min-jae immediately regretted the tone, but the truth remained. His father had never faced a community activist who cooked with the passion of a revolutionary and spoke truth with the precision of a surgeon. After hanging up, Min-jae returned to the untouched birthday cake. He cut another piece, chewed methodically, tasted nothing but texture and temperature. Somewhere across the city, Simone Harrington was probably seasoning her final pot of stew in the community kitchen, preparing to feed families one last time before his bulldozers turned their gathering place into rubble. For the first time in 3 years, Min-jae wished desperately that he could taste something. Anything, to know if his choices left him with sweetness or ash in his mouth. But taste, like regret, was a luxury he could no longer afford. The press conference was supposed to happen at City Hall, but Simone Harrington had other plans. At precisely 9 a.m., she stood in the lobby of Park Industries' gleaming Gangnam Tower, surrounded by 20 reporters and 47 community members holding bowls of her grandmother's gumbo recipe. "We're not here to beg," Simone announced, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd fed hungry mouths for 15 years. "We're here to educate, Mr. Park thinks development means demolition, but I'm going to teach him the difference between building up and tearing down." Min-jae watched from his 42nd floor office as security hesitated. Standard protocol demanded clearing the lobby immediately, but the optics of ejecting elderly Korean grandmothers holding soup bowls would destroy Park Industries' carefully crafted community partnership image. "Sir," Director Choi's voice crackled through the intercom. "Security is requesting guidance. The media is—" "Send her up," Min-jae said quietly. Mrs. Kim's eyebrows rose. "Sir, that's highly irregular. Perhaps we should—" "She wants to educate me?" Min-jae straightened his charcoal tie, checking his reflection in the office's floor-to-ceiling windows. "Let her try." 10 minutes later, Simone Harrington stepped into his office like she belonged there. No nervousness, no deference to the imported Italian marble, or the view that cost more per square meter than most Seoul apartments. She carried a thermos and 2 bowls, her grandmother's golden cross catching the morning light. "Mr. Park," she said, not bowing or offering the traditional Korean greeting. "I brought lunch. It's 9:15 in the morning. Hunger doesn't follow schedules." Simone set the bowls on his conference table, the steam rising like incense. "Neither does demolition, apparently. Your crews were supposed to start Monday. Rumor has it they're beginning tomorrow." Min-jae studied her hands as she ladled soup, calloused from knife work, stained with spices, steady despite the circumstances. "Ms. Harrington, I appreciate your passion for your community, but business decisions aren't made by men who've never been hungry." She slid a bowl toward him, the aroma filling his antiseptic office with something alive, organic, real. "When's the last time you tasted something that mattered?" The question hit like a physical blow. Min-jae's adjusia was known only to Mrs. Kim and his private physician, a weakness that could destroy his authority if revealed to rivals like Director Choi. "I'm not here to discuss my dining habits." "No, you're here to discuss destroying my community's dining habits." Simone sat across from him, making his billion-won office feel suddenly small. "This gumbo fed my family through 3 generations of struggle. My grandmother's recipe, perfected during Jim Crow, refined when she moved to Seoul in 1987 as a military wife, adapted when she started cooking for Korean neighbors who became family." She lifted her spoon, tasted, smiled, an unconscious expression of pure satisfaction that Min-jae envied more than any competitor's profits. "That building you're demolishing? Mrs. Rosa Gonzalez has lived there 40 years. Raised 7 children, buried 2 husbands, survived the 1997 financial crisis by sharing meals with Korean families who couldn't afford food. You want to call that progress?" Min-jae lifted his spoon, mechanically consuming the gumbo. Texture: complex, with tender shrimp and substantial okra. Temperature: perfect. Flavor: nothing. As always, nothing. But something else registered. Not taste, but memory. The warmth recalled his mother's kitchen before the adjusia, before responsibility crushed joy from daily routine. He found himself taking another spoonful, then another, chasing a sensation he couldn't name. "The architectural surveys you referenced," Min-jae said carefully. "What exactly did you find?" Simone's smile sharpened. Building 14C was constructed in 1953, but it sits on the foundation of a 1920s hanok that housed resistance fighters during the Japanese occupation. Mrs. Rosa's apartment building, built with materials from a demolished Buddhist temple, blessed by monks who prayed for community harmony. She pulled out a folder thick with photocopied documents. Historical preservation laws are very clear about sites with cultural significance. One phone call to the Ministry of Culture, and your demolition becomes a 5-year bureaucratic nightmare. Min-jae's chest tightened. Not with fear, but with something he'd thought lost forever. Respect. This woman had done in 3 weeks what his legal team claimed was impossible. Found leverage against Park Industries. "Ms. Harrington, you're clearly intelligent and resourceful. My company can offer you substantial relocation compensation. A new community kitchen in a modern facility. A fully equipped commercial space for your bistro. In a building with no history, no heart, no community." Simone stood, leaving her half-empty bowl. "Mr. Park, you can't relocate Seoul." She moved toward the door, then paused. "I'm hosting a community dinner Friday night, 7 p.m. in the space you plan to demolish. Why don't you come taste what you're really destroying?" After she left, Min-jae sat staring at her abandoned gumbo bowl. The lingering aroma made his office feel less sterile, more human. For the first time in 3 years, he wished desperately to taste what she'd created. Not just the food, but the love seasoned into every ingredient. Mrs. Kim entered quietly, holding a stack of messages. "Sir, how do you want to handle the media requests? They're calling it David versus Goliath with soup spoons." Min-jae pushed the gumbo bowl away. but couldn't quite bring himself to have Mrs. Kim dispose of it. Cancel my Friday evening appointments. Sir? I'm going to dinner. It's time I learned what I've been missing. But even as he said the words, Min-jae wondered if what he'd been missing could ever be recovered, or if some hungers ran too deep for even Simone Harrington's cooking to satisfy. Friday evening descended on Itaewon like a warm embrace, the multicultural neighborhood alive with the sounds of 6 languages mixing in the October air. Min-jae Park sat in his Bentley 3 blocks from Simone's community kitchen, designer suit feeling like armor that suddenly seemed insufficient for the battle ahead. Sir, I've arranged backup security, his driver informed him through the intercom. Discreet surveillance, emergency extraction protocols. I'm going to dinner, not a hostile takeover. Min-jae straightened his navy tie one final time. Wait here. I'll call when I need pickup. The community kitchen occupied the ground floor of Building 14C. The same structure Simone had revealed contained resistance fighter history. Through the windows, Min-jae could see families gathered around mismatched tables, children running between chairs, elderly couples sharing plates with the easy intimacy of decades together. He pushed through the door, and conversation died. 47 pairs of eyes turned toward him. Korean grandmothers, Filipino construction workers, American military wives, Brazilian exchange students. The diversity that made Itaewon unique was also what made his development plans so challenging. You couldn't displace a community this integrated without international attention. Mr. Park. Simone emerged from the kitchen, wearing a flour-dusted apron over dark jeans, her hair pinned back with what looked like a chopstick. You came. I keep my commitments. So do I. She handed him an apron, faded blue cotton with stains that told stories of countless meals. Tonight you don't get served. You help cook. The idea was absurd. Min-jae Park, heir to a multinational conglomerate, didn't prepare food. He had personal chefs, private dining rooms, restaurants that closed their kitchens just to accommodate his schedule. But 47 people were watching. Cameras from 3 news outlets recorded every moment. And Simone Harrington was holding that apron with the same unwavering confidence she'd shown in his office. He tied the apron strings. Have you ever diced onions? Simone asked, leading him toward a prep station that looked like organized chaos. Cutting boards scarred from years of use, knives sharpened to surgical precision, vegetables arranged in rainbow abundance. I've watched others dice onions. That's like saying you've watched others swim while standing on the shore. She pressed a knife into his hand, the weight unfamiliar and somehow significant. Cooking is participation, not observation. Her fingers guided his, showing him how to grip the handle, how to position the blade, how to move in rhythm with the vegetable rather than fighting it. The onion released its sharp aroma, one of the few scents that still registered clearly despite his ageusia. Tell me about resistance, Simone said quietly. Her voice meant only for him, while the community dinner continued around them. What your family resisted, what they fought for. Min-jae's knife paused. The question felt more intimate than any financial negotiation or board meeting confrontation. My great-grandfather resisted Japanese occupation by hiding independence fighters in textile warehouses. My grandfather resisted poverty by building those warehouses into factories. My father resisted irrelevance by expanding into real estate. And you? What are you resisting? The honest answer would have been everything. Taste, connection, the growing certainty that his father's empire was built on foundations as unstable as the hanok that once stood beneath this building. Instead, he continued cutting onions, each slice releasing tears he couldn't taste but felt nonetheless. I resist complacency, he said finally. Progress requires uncomfortable choices. So does love. Simone moved to season a pot of something that smelled like comfort and home. My grandmother resisted Jim Crow by cooking for white families who paid her wages, then using that money to feed black families who couldn't afford groceries. My mother resisted assimilation by teaching me Korean alongside English when we moved here. I resist gentrification by feeding everyone, regardless of what they can afford to pay. She tasted her creation with a wooden spoon, the same unconscious smile of satisfaction he'd noticed in his office. What are you afraid of tasting, Mr. Park? The question penetrated deeper than she could know. For 3 years, Min-jae had told himself that ajuzia was just another business challenge to manage, like market fluctuations or regulatory changes. But watching Simone's evident pleasure in her own cooking, he realized what he'd truly lost wasn't just physical sensation. It was the ability to find joy in simple, essential things. "Mrs. Rosa, come meet our special guest," Simone called across the kitchen. An elderly Latina woman approached, her hands soft with age, but strong from decades of work. "Senor Park," Mrs. Rosa said in accented English, "you want to destroy my home, but first you help cook my dinner. This is, how do you say, ironic? I prefer to think of it as educational," Min-jae replied, surprised by his own honesty. "I'm learning that community means something I hadn't considered. Community means, when my husband died, Korean neighbors brought kimchi because they knew I loved spicy food. Means when Mrs. Kim's grandson needed surgery, we all contributed money even though none of us had much. Means when that young Filipino couple had their baby, 15 women showed up with food for 2 weeks." She touched Min-jae's arm gently. "You build towers, senor. But we built something taller. We built belonging. Your machines can knock down buildings, but can they rebuild belonging?" Dinner was served at 8 p.m., and Min-jae found himself seated between a Korean War veteran and a 10-year-old girl who insisted on teaching him proper chopstick technique. The meal, bulgogi prepared by Mrs. Kim, pancit contributed by the Filipino family, cornbread from Simone's grandmother's recipe, kimchi made by collective effort, represented collaborative creation in a way that challenged every assumption about individual achievement that had driven his career. He ate methodically, tasting nothing but experiencing everything. The warmth of shared conversation, the generosity of strangers including him, despite his role in their displacement, the strange intimacy of communal preparation and consumption. "Mr. Park," the 10-year-old tugged his sleeve. "Do you have kids?" "No, I don't." "Why not? Don't you like families?" The question, innocent and direct, hit harder than any shareholder challenge or media attack. Min-jae looked around the room at families choosing to include him, despite knowing he planned to destroy their gathering place, and felt something shift inside his chest, not taste returning, but hunger awakening. "I like families very much," he told her. "I just forgot how to make one." As the evening wound down, Simone walked him toward the door, past families cleaning dishes together, children asleep on their grandparents' laps, teenagers studying homework at tables cleared of dinner plates. "So?" she asked. "What did you taste tonight?" Min-jae considered lying. Professional pride demanded maintaining the illusion of control. But something about Simone's direct gaze, the lingering warmth of the community kitchen, the weight of Mrs. Rosa's question about rebuilding belonging made honesty feel like the only acceptable currency. "I haven't been able to taste anything for 3 years," he admitted. "Medical condition called ajuzia. Everything tastes like nothing. But tonight," he paused, searching for words to describe the indescribable. "Tonight, I tasted possibility. I tasted what I've been taking away from people without understanding what it meant." Simone's expression softened from challenge to something approaching compassion. "Taste isn't just physical, Min-jae. Sometimes we lose our appetite for life, and food becomes just fuel instead of connection." She untied his apron, her fingers brushing his as she lifted the strap over his head. The contact was brief but electric, sending sensation through his body that had nothing to do with taste buds and everything to do with human connection. "The demolition is scheduled for Monday," he said quietly. "My board expects—" "Your board didn't cook dinner with Mrs. Rosa tonight. Your board didn't learn chopstick technique from a 10-year-old. Your board didn't taste possibility." Simone folded the apron carefully, as if it were precious fabric instead of stained cotton. "You did." Outside, Seoul's neon lights reflected off rain-slicked streets, the city looking different somehow. Less like a chessboard of opportunities, and more like a network of communities connected by shared meals and borrowed hope. In his Bentley, Min-jae's phone buzzed with 17 missed calls from Director Choi and a text from Mrs. Kim. "Sir, we need to discuss Monday's schedule. Several matters require your immediate attention." But for the first time in 3 years, Min-jae wasn't thinking about Monday's responsibilities. He was thinking about the weight of a knife in his hands, the trust in Mrs. Rose's touch, the possibility that hunger, even the kind he couldn't taste, might be the first step toward finding his appetite for something more meaningful than quarterly profits. The demolition was 48 hours away, but tonight felt like the beginning of something rather than the end. Rain drummed against Min-jae's office windows Saturday morning, soul gray and glittering under October clouds that matched his mood. The Harmony Heights demolition permit sat on his desk, requiring only his signature to proceed. But his gold pen remained untouched beside architectural surveys that Simone had forced him to truly see for the first time. Mrs. Kim entered with coffee, imported Jamaican Blue Mountain that he couldn't taste but drank for the caffeine ritual. "Sir, Director Choi has called 3 times about tomorrow's groundbreaking ceremony. Mayor Kim wants confirmation of attendance, and the construction crews cancel it." "Sir?" Mrs. Kim's professional composure cracked slightly. "The ceremony? All of it. The ceremony, the Monday demolition, the entire timeline." Min-jae turned from the window to face her surprised expression. "I need more time to review cultural impact assessments." "Sir, with respect, we've been planning this development for 18 months. The investors, the contractors, the media announcements." Mrs. Kim's voice carried 15 years of professional concern. "Director Choi will be displeased." As if summoned by his name, Choi Sang-min appeared in the doorway, his designer suit immaculate despite the early hour, gold watch catching the artificial light. "Good morning, President Park. I trust you slept well after your community outreach adventure?" The words carried subtle mockery that made Min-jae's jaw clench. "Director Choi, I've decided to postpone the Harmony Heights groundbreaking." Choi's expression didn't change, but his fingers tightened almost imperceptibly around his briefcase handle. "Sir, postponement at this stage would be expensive. Contractor penalties, investor confidence, regulatory complications. May I ask what prompted this decision?" "Due diligence. Something we apparently should have done more thoroughly from the beginning." "Sir, our due diligence was exhaustive, unless you've discovered new information that our legal team missed." Choi's tone remained respectful, but Min-jae detected the challenge underneath. Before Min-jae could respond, his private line buzzed, a call that bypassed Mrs. Kim's screening and connected directly to his desk. Only 3 people had that number: Mrs. Kim, his personal physician, and his mother. "Appa?" His mother's voice carried the gentle authority that still made him feel like a boy caught breaking rules. "I saw the news about your dinner with the community people. Are you well?" Min-jae glanced at Director Choi, who was pretending not to listen while studying his phone. "I'm fine, Iyama. Just reconsidering some business decisions." "Good. Your father always said business without conscience is just expensive greed." Park Moran's voice held the wisdom of someone who'd built a fortune alongside her husband, then watched it nearly destroy their son. "This woman who cooks. Mrs. Kim tells me she's impressive." Heat crept up Min-jae's neck. His mother's intelligence network rivaled any corporate espionage system. "She's principled. Principled is good. Pretty is better. Is she both?" "Iyama, your father was 53 when he realized money couldn't buy happiness, only time to find it elsewhere. You're 52. Don't waste more years than necessary." After hanging up, Min-jae faced Director Choi's barely concealed impatience. "Sir, I've scheduled a board meeting for Monday morning. We can address any concerns about the project timeline then." "Cancel it. I want a weekend to think without committee pressure." Choi's professional mask slipped slightly. "Sir, the board members are flying in from Hong Kong and Shanghai specifically for... Then they can enjoy Seoul's weekend attractions instead of micromanaging decisions that are ultimately mine to make." Min-jae's tone carried the authority that had intimidated competitors and motivated employees for 8 years. "I'll call the board meeting when I'm ready. Until then, no demolitions, no ceremonies, no media announcements." Choi bowed slightly. Proper respect that felt more like a threat. "Of course, President Park. I'll handle the adjustments." After Choi left, Mrs. Kim approached with the careful concern of someone who'd watched Min-jae navigate corporate politics since he was 25. "Sir, Director Choi has been building support for his development philosophy. A significant delay might be seen as weakness. Min-jae smiled grimly. Let him see it that way. Sometimes weakness reveals strength others missed. That evening, Min-jae found himself back in Itaewon, but not at the community kitchen. Simone's bistro, Soul Food, occupied a corner building with warm lighting spilling onto rain-slicked sidewalks. Through the windows, he could see her moving between tables, serving customers with the same focused attention she'd given to seasoning soup the night before. He stood in the rain for 10 minutes, watching her work, before finally pushing through the door. "We're actually full tonight," Simone said, without looking up from the reservation book. "But if you don't mind waiting..." She raised her head, recognition dawning. Min-jae? Hearing his name without formal titles felt intimate and unsettling. I postponed the demolition. Her expression shifted through surprise, suspicion, and something that might have been hope. For how long? Indefinitely. I need to understand what I'd be destroying before I proceed. And you came here to understand? I came here because... Min-jae paused, searching for words that wouldn't sound like corporate manipulation or emotional weakness. Because last night was the first time in 3 years that I wanted to taste something. Even though I couldn't, I wanted to. That seems... significant. Simone studied his face for a long moment, reading expressions he wasn't sure he was ready to reveal. "Kitchen closes in an hour, but I could cook for you afterward. If you want to keep learning, I'd like that." She led him to a corner table while finishing service for her regular customers, a mixture of expatriates, Korean professionals, and neighborhood families who clearly considered Soul Food their second home. Min-jae watched Simone work, noting how she remembered every customer's preferences, how she checked on elderly diners, how she slipped extra portions to the young couple who looked like they couldn't afford full meals. After the last customer left, Simone locked the door and turned off the main lights, leaving only the warm glow from the kitchen pass and candles on Min-jae's table. The intimate lighting transformed the restaurant from a public space into something personal, almost romantic. "What would you like to not taste?" she asked, settling into the chair across from him with a tiredness that spoke of 16-hour workdays and responsibilities that never ended. "Something that matters to you. Something that carries meaning beyond nutrition." Simone disappeared into the kitchen, returning 20 minutes later with 2 bowls and a story. "My grandmother's shrimp and grits." She created this recipe in 1962 when she was the only Black woman in her neighborhood in Atlanta who knew how to cook Korean-style banchan. She combined what she knew with what she learned, feeding 2 cultures that didn't always understand each other. The dish looked simple but smelled complex. Layers of butter, cream, spice, and something ineffable that might have been history itself. Min-jae lifted his spoon, tasted nothing, but felt something shift in his chest that had nothing to do with flavor and everything to do with the woman watching him with gentle expectation. "Tell me what you taste," Simone said softly. "Texture, temperature, the ghost of satisfaction." Min-jae set down his spoon, met her eyes directly, but also hope. "Does that make sense?" "Perfect sense." She reached across the table, her fingers brushing his in a contact that sent electricity through his nervous system. Taste isn't just physical sensation, it's memory, emotion, connection. You lost the physical part, but tonight you're recovering the rest. They talked until 2 a.m., sharing stories that had nothing to do with business or community development, and everything to do with the hungers that drove people toward or away from each other. Simone told him about her divorce, about building a restaurant from nothing, about learning to cook for love after years of cooking for survival. Min-jae found himself revealing the isolation that came with inherited wealth, the pressure that had triggered his ajousia, the growing realization that success without satisfaction was just expensive emptiness. "The demolition permits expire in 2 weeks, he said as she walked him to the door. "I can't delay indefinitely without legal challenges from investors. 2 weeks is enough time to find alternative solutions, if you actually want to find them. And if I do? If I redesign the project to preserve the community instead of displacing it?" Simone paused with her hand on the door lock, studying his expression in the candlelit reflection of the window. Then you'd be the first billionaire I've met who prioritized people over profits. Would that matter to you, personally? The question hung between them like a bridge neither was sure they were ready to cross. Simone's hand moved to his cheek, her thumb tracing the scar he'd carried since childhood, and Min-jae felt more sensation in that gentle touch than he'd experienced in 3 years of expensive meals. Min-jae, she whispered, and then her lips met his. The kiss tasted like nothing and everything, no flavor registering on his damaged palate, but warmth and possibility flooding through his body like wine he couldn't taste but could definitely feel. Her hands tangled in his hair, his arms pulled her closer, and for the first time since his adjusia began, Min-jae understood that some appetites had nothing to do with food, and everything to do with being hungry for someone who could satisfy needs he'd forgotten he had. When they broke apart, breathless and slightly stunned, Simone smiled with the same unconscious satisfaction she showed when tasting her cooking. Now that, she said, had flavor. Outside, Seoul's neon lights reflected off puddles that looked like scattered rainbow fragments. The city beautiful in ways Min-jae had stopped noticing years ago. 2 weeks to find solutions that preserved community while satisfying investors. 2 weeks to prove that some hungers were worth more than quarterly profits. 2 weeks to discover whether a man who'd lost his taste for everything could find his appetite for love. Monday morning descended on Park Industries with the cold efficiency of Korean winter. But Min-jae's office felt warmer somehow, perhaps because Simone's kiss lingered in his memory like a flavor he could almost taste. Mrs. Kim entered with the morning briefings, her expression carefully neutral. "Sir, Director Choi has requested an emergency board meeting for this afternoon. He's citing fiduciary responsibility and investor concerns about the Harmony Heights delay." Mrs. Kim set down a thick folder of contracts and correspondence. "There's also a legal memo about permit expirations and potential penalties." Min-jae opened the folder, scanning documents that would have consumed his attention completely just a week ago. Now they felt like distractions from more pressing concerns, like finding architectural solutions that preserved community while generating acceptable returns, like understanding why Simone's cooking awakened appetites his adjusia couldn't satisfy, like navigating the treacherous politics of challenging his own company's established practices. "Schedule the board meeting for Thursday. Give me 3 more days to develop alternative proposals." Min-jae closed the folder decisively. "And arrange a consultation with Kim & Associates, the firm that specializes in adaptive reuse projects." "Sir, Kim & Associates focuses on historical preservation. Their approach would be unconventional for a Park Industries development. Unconventional might be exactly what we need." Mrs. Kim's eyebrows rose slightly, the closest she ever came to expressing surprise. "Sir, if I may, Director Choi has been making discreet inquiries about your decision-making process. He's particularly interested in the influence of external factors." The warning was carefully phrased but unmistakably clear. Choi was building a case against Min-jae's leadership, and Simone represented a vulnerability that could be exploited. The Korean business world rarely forgave leaders who let personal relationships compromise corporate strategy, especially when those relationships crossed cultural and class boundaries. "Let him make inquiries," Min-jae said evenly. "Just ensure that any documentation of my meetings and decisions reflects appropriate business justification." After Mrs. Kim left, Min-jae called the architectural consulting firm, then spent an hour reviewing zoning regulations and cultural preservation laws. The legal framework was complex but navigable, if he was willing to sacrifice profit margins for community integration. His private line buzzed. Simone's number appeared on the display, and Min-jae felt his pulse quicken in a way that had nothing to do with caffeine. "Good morning?" Her voice carried the warmth of someone who'd spent the morning cooking breakfast for people she cared about. "I wanted to thank you for Saturday night." "I should be thanking you. That was..." Min-jae paused, searching for professional language to describe something entirely personal. "Educational." Simone's laugh carried through the phone like music. "Educational? Is that what we're calling it?" "Simone, I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly. Are there any aspects of your community activism, your restaurant operations, your personal history that could be Misinterpreted by people looking for ways to undermine your credibility? The question came out more bluntly than intended, but Choi's investigation required direct assessment of potential vulnerabilities. Silence stretched between them before Simone responded, her tone cooling noticeably. Are you asking if I have secrets that could embarrass you? I'm asking if you have vulnerabilities that my corporate rivals might exploit to damage both of us. Another pause. When Simone spoke again, her voice carried the careful control of someone who'd learned to protect herself from disappointment. Min-jae, my divorce was public record. Financial difficulties, custody disputes, the whole mess documented in court filings. My restaurant barely broke even until last year. I've been arrested twice for civil disobedience, both times for housing protests that made the news. If your people want to find ammunition against me, they won't have to dig deep. That's not what I meant. Then what did you mean? Because it sounds like you're already planning damage control for being associated with me. Min-jae closed his eyes, recognizing the tactical error. His corporate instincts had overridden his personal intentions, creating exactly the misunderstanding that could destroy whatever was developing between them. Simone, I'm trying to protect us both. My board is looking for reasons to override my decision about Harmony Heights. If they can argue that I'm compromised by personal interests, then maybe you need to decide what's more important, your board's approval or your own conscience. The line went quiet. Min-jae stared at his phone, realizing that in trying to protect their relationship, he'd probably damaged it irreparably. 3 hours later, Mrs. Kim knocked with an urgency that bypassed normal protocols. Sir, we have a situation. Director Choi has called a press conference for 5 p.m. today. He's announcing his appointment as acting president of development operations, citing emergency board authorization. Min-jae's blood chilled. On what grounds? Fiduciary negligence related to the Harmony Heights delay. He's arguing that personal conflicts of interest have compromised your decision-making. Mrs. Kim's professional composure cracked slightly. Sir, he has photographs. What photographs? You and Ms. Harrington leaving her restaurant Saturday night. The intimate nature of the images suggests close surveillance and deliberate documentation. The corporate coup had been planned precisely, executed with timing designed to neutralize Min-jae's authority before he could present alternative development proposals. Choi had weaponized Simone's kiss, turning private affection into public liability. Cancel my afternoon appointments, Min-jae said grimly. I'm going to Itaewon. Sir, that might not be advisable. If Director Choi is monitoring your movements, let him monitor. It's time to stop managing optics and start managing reality. Min-jae found Simone at the community kitchen, teaching a cooking class to teenagers who looked at her with the reverence reserved for heroes. She was demonstrating knife techniques, her hands steady and confident as she showed them how to julienne vegetables with professional precision. Cooking is about respect, she told her students. Respect for the ingredients, respect for the process, respect for the people you're feeding. When you cook with respect, people can taste it. She noticed Min-jae standing in the doorway and nodded acknowledgement, but continued her lesson without interruption. 20 minutes later, after the teenagers had cleaned their stations and left with containers of the soup they'd prepared together, she finally turned to face him directly. Come to apologize or to warn me about more complications? Both. Min-jae stepped into the kitchen, noting how comfortable she looked in this space compared to his corporate environment. Simone, my business partner is planning to remove me from company leadership. He's using our relationship as evidence that I'm unfit to make strategic decisions. And you want me to what? Disappear until your corporate drama resolves itself? I want you to understand the stakes. If Choi succeeds, the demolition happens immediately. No delays, no alternative proposals, no consideration for community preservation. Everything you're fighting for disappears. Simone wiped down her cutting board with movements that spoke of long practice and deeper frustration. So you're asking me to choose between protecting your career and protecting my community? I'm asking you to help me find a way to protect both. How? Min-jae pulled out architectural drawings he'd been developing with the preservation consulting firm. Adaptive reuse instead of demolition. Mixed-income housing that includes subsidized units for current residents. Commercial space reserved for community businesses, including expanded facilities for your restaurant and community kitchen. It's less profitable than the original plan, but it preserves the neighborhood while generating sustainable returns. Simone studied the drawings with the intensity she brought to seasoning complex dishes. This could actually work, she admitted. But can you sell it to your board? Not alone. I need community support, media coverage that frames this as innovative rather than compromised, and enough public backing to make demolition politically costly for Choi. You need me to vouch for you publicly. I need you to stand with me when it matters most. Simone looked around the kitchen that had become her second home, at the evidence of community meals and shared struggles, at the space that represented everything she'd fought to preserve. If we do this together and fail, I lose everything. The restaurant, the community kitchen, the neighborhood I've spent 15 years helping to build. If we don't do this together, you lose it all anyway. At least this way, we lose it fighting for something better. Outside, Seoul's afternoon light slanted through windows that would soon be demolished, unless they could find the courage to challenge systems that prioritized profit over people. Min-jae watched Simone's expression shift from skepticism to calculation, to something that might have been hope seasoned with determination. When's the press conference? She asked finally. Thursday afternoon. 3 days to build support and prepare our alternative proposal. Then we'd better get cooking. Simone untied her apron, her smile carrying the dangerous confidence of someone who'd learned to fight battles that mattered. But Min-jae, next time you want to protect me, try asking what I need instead of assuming what I can't handle. Deal. But Simone, next time I'm threatened with losing everything that matters, remind me that some things are worth the risk. They shook hands like business partners sealing a contract, but the electricity that passed between them had nothing to do with corporate agreements and everything to do with two people choosing to trust each other when trust felt like the most dangerous luxury they could afford. 3 days to save a community, a relationship, and possibly each other. Min-jae had built a business empire on longer odds than that, but he'd never had so much to lose, or someone so important to fight for. Tuesday evening found Min-jae and Simone working side by side in her restaurant after closing, architectural drawings spread across tables still warm from dinner service. Seoul's soul food had become their war room, the place where community preservation met corporate strategy in ways that challenged everything Min-jae had learned about business. The zoning variance requires community impact statements, Min-jae explained, pointing to legal documents that would determine their project's feasibility. But the real challenge is convincing my board that reduced profit margins serve long-term corporate interests. Simone looked up from the financial projections she'd been reviewing, her reading glasses catching the soft restaurant lighting. These numbers assume current residents can afford the subsidized units. What about families like Mrs. Rosa, living on fixed incomes? The City Housing Trust provides rental assistance for qualifying residents. Combined with our below-market pricing, it should cover most cases. Should. But what about families who don't qualify for assistance but can't afford market rates? What about the teenagers I teach cooking who'll graduate from high school into a neighborhood they can no longer afford to live in? Min-jae set down his pen, recognizing the fundamental tension between profit-driven development and community-centered planning. Every corporate solution created gaps that displaced the most vulnerable residents, the very people Simone had spent 15 years serving. We could establish a community fund, he suggested. Park Industries contributes a percentage of development profits to subsidize housing for residents who fall between assistance eligibility and market affordability. That's actually brilliant. Simone's smile lit up features that had grown familiar over the past week. Familiar and increasingly essential to his sense of possibility. It creates ongoing community investment instead of one-time relocation payments. They worked until midnight, refining proposals that balanced corporate viability with social responsibility. The process felt like cooking, combining disparate ingredients until they created something more valuable than their individual components. Min-jae, Simone said as they packed up documents that would shape their Thursday presentation. Can I ask you something personal? After the week we've had, I think we're past worrying about personal boundaries. When did you stop being hungry? Not the adjusia. I mean, when did you stop wanting things that couldn't be quantified in quarterly reports? The question hit deeper than expected. Min-jae considered deflecting with humor or professional distance, but Simone's direct gaze demanded honest response. 3 years ago, when I realized my father's approval would never fill the emptiness that success was supposed to satisfy. He folded the architectural drawings carefully, buying time to organize thoughts he'd never articulated before. I achieved everything he wanted for me, expanded the company, increased profitability, gained respect in the industry. But I felt hollow inside, like I was performing someone else's life. And the adjusia started then? Within 6 months. My doctor said stress-related taste disorders often reflect deeper emotional disconnection. Min-jae met her eyes directly. I stopped tasting food around the same time I stopped tasting life. Simone moved closer, her hand finding his with the naturalness of someone who understood that physical contact could convey comfort that words couldn't carry. What changed? What made you start wanting to taste again? You. The admission felt dangerous and necessary. Watching you cook with such obvious pleasure, seeing you feed people like their nourishment mattered personally to you, realizing that I'd built a fortune but never created anything that satisfied hunger in ways that actually mattered. They stood in the darkened restaurant, Seoul's neon lights painting rainbow patterns across tables where families had shared meals. Strangers had become friends. Community had been nourished one conversation at a time. The intimacy of the moment felt as fragile and essential as the neighborhood they were fighting to preserve. Simone, I need to tell you something about Thursday's presentation. If our proposal fails, if the board votes against adaptive reuse, I'm prepared to resign from Park Industries rather than oversee the demolition. Her eyes widened. Min-jae, that's your family legacy. 3 generations of work. 3 generations of work. That means nothing if it destroys communities instead of building them. He pulled her closer, his hands framing her face with reverent attention. I'd rather lose the company than lose the possibility of becoming someone you could respect. You already are someone I respect. But are you someone you can respect? The question crystallized everything he'd been struggling to understand about success, satisfaction, and the difference between achievement and fulfillment. Min-jae had spent 8 years trying to taste victory in corporate conquest that left him hungrier than when he started. But standing here with Simone, fighting for something bigger than profit margins, he felt appetite returning for things that mattered beyond quarterly earnings. I'm learning to be, he said quietly, and then kissed her with the desperation of someone who'd discovered that love might be the only flavor worth recovering. This kiss was different from Saturday night's tentative exploration. Deeper, more urgent, seasoned with the knowledge that they had 48 hours to save everything they'd begun building together. Simone's hands tangled in his hair, pulling him closer, and Min-jae tasted possibility again. Not on his damaged palate, but in the certainty that some hungers were worth any risk to satisfy. When they broke apart, breathless and slightly overwhelmed by the intensity of connection that had developed so quickly, Simone rested her forehead against his. Promise me something, she whispered. Win or lose Thursday, don't disappear from my life. Don't let corporate politics destroy what we're creating here. I promise. But Simone, you have to promise me something too. If this goes badly, if we lose the vote and the community gets displaced, don't let my failure stop you from fighting other battles. The world needs people who cook with love and fight with conscience. Deal. But Min-jae, we're not going to lose. We're going to walk into that boardroom Thursday and show them that some things matter more than maximum profit margins. We're going to prove that business can nourish communities instead of consuming them. Outside, Seoul's late-night energy pulsed through Itaewon's multicultural streets. The neighborhood alive with possibility, despite the threat hanging over its future. Min-jae held Simone close, breathing in the lingering aromas of garlic and hope that clung to her hair, and realized that recovery, of taste, of purpose, of the capacity to love something beyond his own success, might require demolishing the walls he'd built around his heart, rather than the buildings that housed other people's dreams. Wednesday morning arrived with unseasonable warmth, Seoul's autumn air carrying hints of change that Min-jae felt in his bones as he reviewed final presentation materials in his office. 24 hours until the board vote that would determine everything: the community's future, his relationship with Simone, and the direction of a company that had defined 3 generations of Park family identity. Mrs. Kim entered with coffee and concern etched in the lines around her eyes. "Sir, Director Choi has scheduled individual meetings with board members this afternoon. Private discussions about company direction and leadership stability. Let me guess, he's building consensus against the adaptive reuse proposal before tomorrow's presentation. More than that, sir. He's questioning your fitness for leadership, citing emotional compromise and strategic inconsistency." Mrs. Kim's voice carried the weight of someone who'd watched corporate coups destroy careers and families. "Sir, he has more than just photographs now. He's obtained financial records showing your personal contributions to community organizations, your consulting payments to preservation architects, your involvement with Ms. Harrington's world." Min-jae felt cold certainty settle in his stomach. Choi had weaponized every gesture of connection, every step toward community engagement, turning compassion into evidence of corporate betrayal. The Korean business world rarely forgave leaders who prioritized relationships over ruthless efficiency. What's the board sentiment? Mixed. 3 members support your leadership unconditionally. 3 are leaning toward Director Choi's position. The deciding votes belong to Mr. Wu from the Hong Kong operations and Ms. Chen from Shanghai, both of whom prioritize profitability above all other considerations. 7 board members would decide his fate, and by extension, the fate of 47 families who'd trusted him to find solutions that preserved community while generating sustainable returns. The mathematics of corporate democracy suddenly felt like the arithmetic of displacement. Numbers that looked clean on spreadsheets, but concealed human costs that couldn't be quantified. His private line buzzed. Simone's number triggered the now familiar acceleration of pulse that had nothing to do with caffeine and everything to do with connection that transcended corporate strategy. "Good morning." Her voice carried the warmth of someone who'd started her day cooking breakfast for people she loved. "I wanted to check your mental state before the final countdown." Realistic pessimism mixed with stubborn determination. "How's the community response to our proposal?" "Cautiously optimistic, Mrs. Rosa has convinced 8 families to attend tomorrow's board meeting as witnesses. The teenagers from my cooking classes created a presentation about the economic impact of displacement. Even the Korean grandmothers who initially distrusted changes to the neighborhood are willing to support adaptive reuse if it means keeping their community intact." Min-jae closed his eyes, feeling the weight of trust that had been placed in their collaborative solution. These families were gambling their housing stability on his ability to convince a board that saw them as obstacles to profit rather than people deserving consideration. "Simone, there's something you need to know. Director Choi is building a case that my involvement with you represents a conflict of interest that compromises my judgment." Silence stretched between them, filled with implications that neither wanted to articulate. When Simone spoke again, her voice carried the careful control of someone who'd learned to protect herself from disappointment. "Do you think he's right? Have I compromised your judgment?" "You've clarified my judgment. There's a difference. Is there? Because from where I'm standing, it looks like falling for a community activist has put you in a position where you might lose everything your family built." Min-jae stared out his office windows at the Seoul skyline, towers of glass and steel that represented achievement without soul, success without satisfaction. "Simone, my family built a fortune, but I'm not sure they built anything that actually mattered. If losing the company is the price of finding something worth fighting for, maybe that's not loss. Maybe that's finally waking up. And if we lose tomorrow, if the board votes for demolition and your resignation doesn't change anything, then we'll have fought for something bigger than ourselves. Sometimes the battle matters more than victory." After hanging up, Min-jae spent the afternoon in meetings that felt like rituals. Final reviews of financial projections, architectural specifications, community impact assessments that demonstrated the viability of preserving neighborhood character while generating acceptable returns. The numbers supported their proposal, but corporate decisions weren't always about numbers. They were about power, control, and the willingness to challenge systems that prioritized extraction over investment. At 6 p.m., Mrs. Kim knocked with the urgent formality that signaled serious complications. "Sir, Director Choi has called a press conference for 8 o'clock tonight. He's announcing preliminary board support for accelerated demolition and his assumption of primary development authority." "On what grounds?" "The board doesn't vote until tomorrow." Emergency provisions in the corporate charter. If a majority of board members express concern about executive decision-making, they can authorize interim leadership changes pending formal review. Min-jae felt the trap closing with mechanical precision. Choi had outmaneuvered him politically, using corporate procedures to consolidate power before the community proposal could be formally considered. Tomorrow's presentation would become a formality rather than a decision point. "Sir, there might be one option. Mrs." Kim's voice carried reluctant hope. "Your mother called this morning. She's been reviewing the company charter and bylaws. There's a provision that allows founding family members to call for emergency shareholder meetings if they believe current leadership is acting against the company's foundational principles. My mother wants to intervene in board politics. Your mother wants to protect her son and the company her husband built. She's prepared to invoke family override provisions if necessary." The implications hit Min-jae like cold water. His mother's intervention would save his position, but at the cost of appearing unable to manage corporate challenges independently. It would confirm Choi's narrative about compromised leadership, while potentially preserving his authority through family nepotism, rather than professional competence. "Tell my mother I appreciate her concern, but I need to handle this without family rescue operations. If I can't convince the board on merit, I don't deserve to lead the company." Mrs. Kim's expression reflected 15 years of watching Min-jae navigate impossible choices with stubborn integrity. "Sir, sometimes accepting help isn't weakness, it's strategy. And sometimes fighting alone is the only way to prove what you're actually fighting for." At 7:30, Min-jae left his office for what might be the last time as Park Industries president. The evening air carried the scent of street food and autumn leaves, Soul's energy flowing around him as he walked toward Itaewon instead of driving. He needed the time to think, to prepare for a battle that would determine whether love and community could triumph over profit and power. He found Simone at the community kitchen, but she wasn't cooking. She was sitting with Mrs. Rosa and 5 other residents, reviewing documents that looked suspiciously like legal filings. "Min-jae?" Simone stood with the fluid grace of someone preparing for combat. "We need to talk." "What are those papers?" Mrs. Rosa answered with the quiet dignity of someone who'd survived decades of fighting for basic rights. "Historical preservation applications, filed with the city this afternoon, along with requests for emergency injunctions against demolition pending cultural significance review." Min-jae stared at the documents, understanding dawning slowly. "You're using legal procedures to block demolition independent of corporate decisions." "We're using every tool available to protect our community," Simone said firmly, "including tools that don't require your board's permission." The strategy was brilliant and heartbreaking. The community had prepared for his failure by developing backup plans that assumed corporate compassion would prove insufficient. They'd learned to trust legal procedures more than corporate promises, bureaucratic delays more than personal relationships. "Simone, if these injunctions succeed, they could tie up development for years. The financial losses would be enormous, and the board would have every justification for removing me from leadership. Would that be worse than watching bulldozers destroy everything these families have built?" The question forced Min-jae to confront the fundamental tension between corporate loyalty and moral responsibility. His board would view community legal challenges as hostile acts requiring aggressive response, but the families filing those challenges were simply protecting themselves from displacement that corporate decisions had made inevitable. "No," he said quietly. "It wouldn't be worse. It would be justice." Mrs. Rosa smiled with the satisfaction of someone who'd correctly judged character under pressure. "Senor Min-jae, you understand now. Sometimes love means fighting even when fighting costs everything." Outside, Director Choi's press conference was probably beginning, announcing corporate changes that would accelerate demolition and marginalize community concerns. But inside the community kitchen, surrounded by families who'd chosen legal resistance over resignation, Min-jae felt something shift in his chest that had nothing to do with taste buds, and everything to do with finally understanding what battles were worth losing everything to win. Tomorrow's board meeting would determine his corporate future. But tonight, surrounded by people who cooked with love and fought with conscience, he'd already discovered what kind of man he wanted to become, regardless of what kind of president the board decided he should be. Thursday morning broke gray and unforgiving over Seoul, matching Min-jae's mood as he prepared for the board meeting that would determine his professional future and the community's survival. The historical preservation injunctions that Mrs. Rosa's group had filed were already making headlines. Community fights corporate giant with legal cuisine, and David vs. Goliath, Soul Food Edition. Mrs. Kim entered his office with documents and barely concealed anxiety. "Sir, Director Choi's press conference last night has generated complications. 3 board members have formally requested your resignation pending investigation of leadership competency. The emergency provisions have been invoked." "Which 3? Mr. Wu, Ms. Chen, and surprisingly, Director Park from the construction division. Apparently, Director Choi convinced him that community legal challenges represent a threat to all Park Industries' development projects." Min-jae felt the mathematics of corporate betrayal crystallizing around him. 4 votes against his leadership, 3 in support, with the deciding vote belonging to whichever board member could be convinced that stability mattered more than innovation. "The meeting is still scheduled for 2 p.m.? "Yes, sir. But, sir..." Mrs. Kim hesitated with the careful concern of someone delivering devastating news. "There's been another development. The preservation injunctions were dismissed this morning. Judge ruled that historical significance claims require more substantive evidence than photocopied documents and community testimony. The legal strategy that had seemed brilliant last night had crumbled under judicial scrutiny, leaving the community vulnerable to demolition, regardless of the board's decision about Min-jae's leadership. Choi had probably orchestrated the legal challenge's failure as well, ensuring that corporate victory would be complete and unobstructed. "Sir, your mother called. She's prepared to invoke emergency family provisions if necessary." "I already told you." "Sir, with respect, pride becomes irrelevant when communities are at stake. Your mother isn't offering rescue. She's offering ammunition." Min-jae's private line buzzed before he could respond. Simone's number appeared on the display, but when he answered, her voice carried defeat instead of the usual warmth. "The injunctions failed," she said without preamble. "Judge dismissed them at 9 a.m. We have no legal protection against demolition." "Simone, I'm sorry. The community fought brilliantly, but..." "Min-jae, there's something else. Director Choi contacted me this morning. He offered to buy Soul Food for triple its assessed value, relocate the community kitchen to a modern facility in Gangnam, and provide 5-year operating subsidies for both restaurants." Min-jae's blood chilled. And he suggested that accepting his offer would demonstrate my commitment to practical solutions over idealistic protests. He made it very clear that refusing would result in total displacement with no compensation. The corporate coup had expanded beyond boardroom politics to direct intimidation of community leaders. Choi was systematically eliminating every alternative to complete demolition, ensuring that Min-jae's presentation would be irrelevant regardless of its merit. "What did you tell him?" "I told him I needed time to consider his offer." Which was a lie. "I needed time to warn you that he's planning to use my response as evidence that community support for adaptive reuse is conditional and financially motivated." Min-jae closed his eyes, recognizing the trap's final elements. If Simone accepted Choi's buyout, it would prove that community resistance could be purchased. If she refused, it would demonstrate unrealistic idealism that justified forced relocation. Either choice strengthened Choi's narrative that corporate efficiency trumped community sentiment. "Simone, whatever you decide about Choi's offer, base it on what's best for you and the restaurant. Don't let my corporate battles influence your survival decisions. Min-jae, your corporate battles are my survival decisions. If you lose this afternoon, demolition starts tomorrow. If I take Choi's money, I lose Soul Food's community roots even if I keep the business operating. There are no clean choices here." The phone went quiet, both of them recognizing that love had become entangled with corporate strategy in ways that made every decision a betrayal of someone's trust. Min-jae had wanted to protect Simone from his professional complications, but instead had drawn her deeper into conflicts where winning required sacrificing principles that made victory meaningful. At 1 p.m., Min-jae walked toward the boardroom where his corporate fate would be decided. Architectural drawings and financial projections tucked under his arm like armor that might prove insufficient for the battle ahead. The Park Industries building felt different somehow. Less like home, and more like a monument to achievements that had lost their savor along with everything else that mattered. The boardroom occupied the 45th floor, floor-to-ceiling windows offering panoramic views of Seoul's relentless expansion. 7 board members sat around the mahogany table that had hosted 3 generations of Park family decisions, their expressions ranging from sympathetic to hostile to carefully neutral. Director Choi stood at the presentation screen, his gold watch catching the afternoon light as he gestured toward profit projections that made adaptive reuse look financially irresponsible. Gentlemen, ladies, the numbers speak clearly. President Park's proposed modifications would reduce project profitability by 43%, while increasing construction timelines by 18 months. Meanwhile, community legal challenges demonstrate organized resistance to any development, regardless of accommodations offered. Mr. Wu from Hong Kong operations nodded approvingly. Director Choi's analysis confirms our concerns about emotional decision-making compromising corporate strategy. Park Industries cannot afford leadership that prioritizes sentiment over shareholder value. Ms. Chen from Shanghai added her support with the precision of someone who viewed relationships as balance sheets. The preservation injunctions, though unsuccessful, indicate community hostility that will generate ongoing complications. Clean demolition eliminates future legal challenges. Min-jae listened to his corporate funeral with the detached fascination of watching someone else's disaster. These board members had never cooked dinner with Mrs. Rosa, never learned knife techniques from Simone, never tasted possibility in community kitchens that fed souls alongside bodies. They spoke fluent profit and loss, but couldn't comprehend languages of connection and nourishment. Director Choi, Min-jae said when the presentation concluded, your analysis assumes that maximizing short-term profits serves long-term corporate interests. But what about reputational costs? What about sustainable community relationships? What about the possibility that businesses can create value beyond quarterly earnings? Choi's smile carried the confidence of someone holding decisive cards. President Park, business success is measured in quantifiable results, not idealistic aspirations. Your emotional attachment to this particular community has clearly compromised your ability to make objective strategic decisions. Has it? Or has it clarified what strategy actually means? Min-jae moved to the presentation screen, replacing Choi's demolition timeline with architectural drawings that showed preserved neighborhood character integrated with modern housing design. Ladies and gentlemen, what if profitability and community preservation aren't mutually exclusive? What if adaptive reuse creates more sustainable value than demolition and replacement? For 30 minutes, he presented financial models that demonstrated long-term returns from mixed-income housing, community business partnerships, and cultural tourism that celebrated rather than eliminated neighborhood diversity. The numbers were compelling, but he could see skepticism in board members' expressions. Doubt about whether community integration justified reduced profit margins. The question, Min-jae concluded, isn't whether we can afford to preserve this community. It's whether we can afford to become the kind of company that destroys communities for marginal profit increases. Director Park from Construction spoke first. President Park, your proposal has merit, but the community legal challenges suggest resistance to any development. How do you address organized opposition? By making community members partners instead of obstacles. Mrs. Rose's preservation applications weren't attacks. They were desperate attempts to protect homes that our original proposal would have eliminated. And Ms. Harrington? Ms. Chen's question carried the sharp edge of someone who'd investigated personal relationships for professional weaknesses. How do we evaluate community partnership proposals when the primary advocate is romantically involved with company leadership? The question hung in the room like smoke, poisoning every strategic argument with implications of compromised judgment and corporate impropriety. Min-jae felt the trap's final spring. His relationship with Simone had become the lens through which every decision would be viewed, every choice questioned. Ms. Chen, My personal relationships don't compromise my professional judgment. They clarify it. Meeting Simone taught me that communities are assets worth preserving rather than obstacles to eliminate. That's not corruption. That's education. Education that costs Park Industries 43% profit reduction, Mr. Wu interjected. President Park, personal enlightenment is commendable, but shareholders expect financial returns, not social experiments. The board vote was called at 4 p.m. 4 members voted for Min Jae's removal and immediate demolition. 2 supported his adaptive reuse proposal. The deciding vote belonged to Director Kim from Operations, a woman who'd worked with the Park family for 22 years and understood that some decisions transcended financial calculations. This company was built on innovation, Director Kim said quietly. Sometimes innovation means preserving value instead of extracting it. I vote to support President Park's community partnership proposal. The room went silent. 3 votes for preservation, 4 for demolition. Min Jae had lost by a single vote, but the narrow margin demonstrated that corporate conscience hadn't been entirely purchased by quarterly profit requirements. Very well, Director Choi said with satisfaction that felt premature. The board has spoken. Demolition proceeds tomorrow morning, and I assume interim development authority pending formal leadership review. But Mrs. Kim, who had been unusually quiet throughout the meeting, stood with documents that made Choi's expression shift from triumph to concern. Actually, Mrs. Kim said with the calm authority of someone who'd spent 15 years managing corporate crises, there's one more matter to consider. Emergency family provisions, invoked this morning by Mrs. Park Moran as primary shareholder, require board reconsideration of any decision affecting company foundational principles. Min Jae stared at his assistant with amazement and horror. His mother had intervened despite his explicit request, using family authority to override board democracy in ways that would permanently damage his credibility as an independent leader. But as Mrs. Kim distributed documents that outlined the family override process, Min Jae realized that some battles required accepting help, even when pride preferred fighting alone. His mother wasn't rescuing him from failure. She was providing tools to turn defeat into victory that honored both business sense and social conscience. The second vote, held under emergency family provisions, reversed the first by a margin of 4-3. Min Jae retained leadership. The adaptive reuse proposal was approved for implementation, and Director Choi's interim authority was terminated before it officially began. But as board members filed out with expressions ranging from relieved to resentful, Min Jae understood that winning through family intervention had cost him the independent authority that made leadership meaningful. He'd saved the community and preserved his relationship with Simone, but at the price of proving that Park family blood mattered more than professional competence. Outside, Seoul's evening air carried the scent of street food and possibility, but victory tasted as flavorless as everything else in Min Jae's life. He'd learned to fight for community and love, but he still couldn't taste the satisfaction of battles won through compromise rather than conviction. Some hungers, it seemed, required more than political victory to satisfy. Friday morning found Min Jae standing in his office, staring at resignation papers he'd drafted at 4 a.m., when victory felt more like defeat. The emergency family provisions had saved his position and the community, but at the cost of proving that Park Industries remained a family dynasty rather than a professional meritocracy. Board members who'd supported him now questioned whether he could lead without maternal intervention, while those who'd opposed him viewed the override as confirmation of nepotistic privilege. Mrs. Kim entered with coffee and the morning's media coverage. Sir, the business press is calling it "Billionaire's Mother Saves Community with Corporate Coup." Public reaction is mixed. Min Jae scanned headlines that ranged from supportive to skeptical. When family values meet business sense, and corporate democracy dies in Seoul boardroom. The narrative frameworks made him appear either as a principled leader constrained by corporate politics or as a privileged heir whose mother rescued him from professional incompetence. What about the community response? Celebratory relief, mostly. Mrs. Rosa organized a Thanksgiving dinner at the community kitchen for tonight. They're calling it the Salvation Supper and inviting everyone who supported preservation efforts. Mrs. Kim's expression carried the careful concern of someone who'd watched corporate victories become personal losses. Sir, Ms. Harrington called this morning. She asked if you're planning to attend. The question carried implications that Min-jae wasn't sure he could navigate successfully. Attending the celebration would demonstrate commitment to community partnership, but it would also reinforce perceptions that personal relationships drove his corporate decisions. Staying away would suggest that victory had eliminated his interest in the people he'd fought to protect. Tell Simone I'll be there. Whatever the optics, those families deserve to know that their preservation matters more than corporate reputation management. At noon, Director Choi requested a private meeting, the first direct conversation between them since the board coup's failure. He entered Min-jae's office with the controlled composure of someone who'd lost a battle, but hadn't abandoned the war. President Park, I want to discuss transition logistics for the Harmony Heights redesign. Transition logistics? My resignation from Park Industries, effective immediately. Choi placed a formal letter on Min-jae's desk with the precision of someone who'd calculated every strategic element. I've accepted a position with Kim Development Group as Senior Vice President of Acquisition Strategy. Min-jae studied the resignation letter, recognizing that Choi's departure solved immediate political problems while creating larger strategic challenges. Kim Development Group was Park Industries' primary competitor, and Choi's insider knowledge of company operations would be invaluable to rivals seeking competitive advantages. Director Choi, you've been with Park Industries for 12 years. Are you certain that leaving serves your long-term career interests? President Park, yesterday's board meeting demonstrated fundamental philosophical differences about corporate strategy. I believe aggressive development maximizes shareholder value. You believe community partnership justifies profit reduction. Choi's tone remained respectfully professional while delivering what felt like a threat. Kim Development Group shares my philosophy about efficient market operations. The implication was clear. Choi would use his new position to acquire properties that Park Industries' community-centered approach left vulnerable, potentially undermining the adaptive reuse model by surrounding preserved neighborhoods with aggressive developments that eliminated their cultural character. I respect your decision, Director Choi, but I hope your new position allows you to discover that efficiency and community preservation aren't mutually exclusive. We'll see, won't we? Choi smiled with the confidence of someone who'd found more profitable ways to wage the same war. Good luck with your social experiment, President Park. The market will determine whether idealism generates sustainable returns. After Choi left, Min-jae spent the afternoon reviewing architectural specifications for the Harmony Heights redesign, trying to focus on practical implementation details instead of the growing certainty that preserving one community had triggered conflicts that could threaten others. The adaptive reuse model required sustained commitment from board members who viewed yesterday's family override as temporary accommodation rather than permanent corporate philosophy change. His private line buzzed at 5 p.m. His mother's number appeared on the display, and Min-jae felt the complicated gratitude that came from being rescued in ways he'd never requested. Min-jae, ya? His mother's voice carried the gentle authority that had shaped his childhood, and apparently still influenced his corporate battles. Are you angry with me? I'm grateful, Iyama, but I'm also concerned about the precedent. Board members need to trust that I can lead independently. Leadership isn't about independence, my son. It's about knowing when to accept help and when to fight alone. Yesterday, you needed help. Tomorrow, you might need to fight alone. Wisdom means recognizing the difference. Park Moran's voice carried the experience of someone who'd built a business empire alongside her husband, while maintaining relationships that transcended corporate strategy. This woman you're fighting for, tell me about her. Simone. She's remarkable. Intelligent, principled, completely unimpressed by wealth or corporate authority. She cooks like an artist and fights like a warrior. Does she love you? The question was so direct that Min-jae almost dropped the phone. Korean mothers rarely discussed romantic relationships with such bluntness, but Park Miran had never followed conventional expectations about maternal boundaries. I think so. But Iyama, everything is complicated by corporate politics and community pressure. She knows that our relationship affects her neighborhood's future. Love is always complicated by circumstances, Min-jae, ya. The question is whether the complications strengthen connection or destroy it. Bring her to dinner Sunday. I want to meet the woman who taught my son to taste possibility again. After hanging up, Min-jae realized that his mother had somehow learned about his ajuzia, despite his efforts to keep the condition private. Park family intelligence networks apparently operated at levels that made corporate espionage seem amateur by comparison. At 7 p.m., he walked through Itaewon toward the community kitchen where families were gathering to celebrate preservation victory with shared meals and cautious optimism. The neighborhood felt different somehow, less threatened, more permanent, as if community roots had grown deeper through the struggle to protect them. The kitchen was packed with 43 residents, 5 journalists, and 3 city council members who'd supported the preservation applications. Tables overflowed with dishes representing the multicultural diversity that made Itaewon unique. Korean kimchi, alongside Filipino lumpia, Brazilian feijoada served next to American cornbread. Fusion flavors that spoke languages of integration rather than assimilation. Min-jae! Simone appeared at his shoulder, her smile lighting features that had become essential to his sense of possibility. You came. I told you I would. I know. But corporate executives sometimes make promises that corporate circumstances force them to break. She led him toward a table where Mrs. Rosa was serving gumbo from a pot that looked large enough to feed entire neighborhoods. The elderly woman smiled with satisfaction that transcended the immediate victory. The deep contentment of someone who'd protected something precious against powerful forces that wanted to eliminate it. Senor Min-jae, you kept your promise. The community is safe. For now. But Mrs. Rosa, the fight isn't over. Other developers will see our success as a challenge to overcome. We need to be prepared for continued pressure. Mijo, some fights never end. They just change shapes. But tonight, we celebrate. Tomorrow, we cook and fight again if necessary. Min-jae accepted a bowl of gumbo that he couldn't taste, but consumed with appreciation for everything it represented. Tradition preserved, community nourished, relationships strengthened through shared struggle. Around him, conversations flowed in 6 languages, while children ran between tables and elderly couples shared plates with the intimacy of decades together. Speech! Speech! Someone called, and 43 voices took up the chant, until Min-jae found himself standing with a microphone that someone had connected to the community kitchen's sound system. Ladies and gentlemen, families and friends, he began, his voice carrying over conversations that had grown quiet with attention. This week taught me that business success isn't measured only in profit margins. It's measured in communities preserved, relationships honored, and the courage to fight for values that can't be quantified on balance sheets. Applause rippled through the room. Min-jae continued, his words coming from places in his heart that had been closed for 3 years. I came to this neighborhood intending to demolish buildings and displace families. Instead, I learned to cook with Mrs. Rosa's guidance, to season food with Simone's expertise, and to understand that some things are worth more than the price developers are willing to pay for them. More applause. In the crowd, Min-jae spotted Director Kim from his board, Mrs. Kim from his office, and surprisingly, 2 reporters who'd been covering the preservation story with skeptical interest. The Harmony Heights project will move forward, but as community partnership rather than corporate conquest. Mixed-income housing that includes long-term residents, commercial space reserved for local businesses, and shared facilities that strengthen rather than eliminate neighborhood character. This isn't charity. It's recognizing that communities are assets worth preserving, rather than obstacles to remove. The final applause was sustained and genuine, but Min-jae felt the weight of promises that would require years of sustained effort to fulfill. Preserving one community had been difficult. Maintaining that commitment while managing corporate pressures and competitive challenges would demand resources he wasn't sure Park Industries possessed. Later, as the celebration wound down and families began cleaning dishes together, Simone walked him toward the door with the easy intimacy of someone who'd shared battles that mattered. Thank you, she said simply. For fighting when fighting wasn't easy. For accepting help when pride preferred independence. For proving that some billionaires can learn to taste more than profit margins. Thank you for teaching me what was worth fighting for. They stood in the doorway between the community kitchen and Seoul's neon-lit streets. Between the warmth of shared victory and the uncertainty of whatever challenges tomorrow would bring. Min-jae pulled Simone closer, kissing her with the desperate gratitude of someone who'd discovered that love could survive corporate battles and emerge stronger for having been tested. "Min-jae," she whispered against his lips. "What happens now? The community is safe, but what about us? Now we learn whether love can exist independently of the crisis that created it. Whether we can build something lasting when we're not fighting for survival. And if we can't? If removing external pressure reveals that we don't have enough internal connection to sustain a relationship." Min-jae considered the question seriously, recognizing that victory had eliminated the shared mission that had brought them together. Without community preservation as common ground, they'd need to discover whether mutual attraction could develop into deeper connection. Then we'll have learned something valuable about ourselves and each other. "But Simone, I'd like to find out if we can love each other as successfully as we fought together." Outside, Seoul's autumn air carried the promise of winter's approach. Seasons changing in ways that felt like metaphors for transformation that couldn't be reversed. Min-jae had saved a community and discovered love, but he'd also learned that some hungers required ongoing nourishment rather than single victories to satisfy. The taste of possibility lingered on his tongue, like a flavor he was finally beginning to recognize. Saturday morning brought unexpected visitors to Min-jae's Gangnam penthouse. His mother and Mrs. Kim, both carrying containers of homemade food and expressions that suggested intervention was about to occur whether he welcomed it or not. Park Miran settled onto his minimalist sofa with the authority of someone who decorated his childhood and apparently felt entitled to redecorate his adult relationships. "Min-jae, yeah, this apartment looks like a hotel suite. Where do you actually live?" His mother surveyed the imported furniture and sterile artwork with maternal disapproval. "No wonder you lost your ability to taste. There's nothing here with flavor or memory." Mrs. Kim began unpacking containers of kimchi, bulgogi, and banchan that filled his antiseptic kitchen with aromas of home and connection. "Sir, your mother and I have been discussing your situation. We've concluded that certain conversations are overdue." Min-jae felt the familiar combination of gratitude and exasperation that came from being managed by women who loved him enough to ignore his preferences for privacy. "What conversations?" "About your adjusia, your relationship with Ms. Harrington, and the corporate challenges that aren't resolved just because yesterday's board meeting went well." Park Miran's tone carried the no-nonsense authority that had intimidated business rivals and motivated family members for 30 years. "Sit down, eat your mother's cooking, and listen." The meal was consumed in silence that felt loaded with unspoken concerns. Min-jae chewed methodically, tasting nothing but texture and temperature, while his mother and assistant exchanged meaningful glances that suggested coordinated strategy. "Mrs. Kim," his mother said finally, "tell him about Director Choi's new position." Mrs. Kim cleared her throat with the formality that preceded difficult news. "Sir, Director Choi's move to Kim Development Group is more problematic than his resignation letter suggested. He's been appointed to lead their new Community Integration Initiative, a program designed to acquire properties that Park Industries' preservation approach leaves vulnerable." "Meaning what, exactly?" "Meaning Choi plans to surround preserved communities with aggressive developments that eliminate their cultural character while staying technically legal. If families can't afford the increased living costs that come with upscale surrounding development, they'll sell voluntarily, achieving displacement without direct demolition." Min-jae set down his chopsticks, understanding dawning slowly. Choi's departure hadn't ended the threat to Itaewon. It had relocated and refined the strategy, making community destruction more subtle, but no less complete. "He's weaponizing our preservation model against itself." "Precisely. And sir, there are other communities facing similar pressures. Kim Development Group is targeting 6 neighborhoods where Park Industries has projects under consideration. They're moving fast while our company adapts to the adaptive reuse model." Park Miran leaned forward with the intensity of someone who'd built business empires by recognizing strategic patterns before competitors understood them. "Min-jae, yeah, preserving one community was the beginning, not the end. If you want to change how development works in Seoul, you need to scale compassion without losing efficiency." "Scale compassion?" "Make community partnership profitable enough that other developers adopt the model instead of fighting it. Right now, You're a social experiment that competitors are trying to prove unsustainable. You need to become a business model that competitors want to copy. Mrs. Kim pulled out financial projections that made Min-jae realize the Saturday morning intervention had been planned with corporate-level precision. Sir, I've been analyzing the numbers. Adaptive reuse actually generates higher long-term returns than demolition and replacement, but only if implemented systematically across multiple projects. The math works at scale? The math works brilliantly at scale. Mixed-income housing reduces vacancy rates, community business partnerships create stable commercial tenants, cultural tourism generates additional revenue streams, and preserved neighborhoods appreciate in value more consistently than generic developments. Mrs. Kim's presentation skills had apparently expanded beyond corporate administration to strategic planning. But sir, scaling requires standardized procedures, dedicated staff, and board support that goes beyond yesterday's narrow vote. Min-jae studied projections that suggested his mother and assistant had spent considerable time developing solutions to problems he was just beginning to understand. How long have you two been planning this conversation? Since Tuesday, Park Moran admitted with satisfaction. Mrs. Kim called me after Director Choi's first attempt to undermine your authority. We decided that family intervention was preferable to family funeral arrangements. And the community partnership model. We've been analyzing successful examples from other cities. Portland's urban renewal projects, Barcelona's neighborhood preservation initiatives, Tokyo's adaptive reuse programs. The business case is stronger than you realize, but implementation requires treating community development as core corporate strategy rather than social experiment. Mrs. Kim handed him a folder thick with research and recommendations. Sir, I've also been investigating Ms. Harrington's background more thoroughly. Not for corporate security purposes, she added quickly, but to understand her qualifications for potential partnership roles. Partnership roles? Her restaurant management experience, community organizing skills, and cultural competency make her an ideal candidate for Director of Community Relations, a position that doesn't currently exist but should. Park Moran's tone suggested she'd already decided Simone's corporate future. If you're going to scale community partnership, you need someone who speaks fluent neighborhood. The suggestion was logical and terrifying in equal measure. Offering Simone a corporate position would solve several strategic problems while creating new personal complications. Their relationship had developed through shared battles. Working together daily might strengthen their connection or expose incompatibilities that crisis had obscured. Has anyone asked Simone if she wants to work for Park Industries? Has anyone asked you if you want to be successful? Park Moran's question carried the exasperated affection of someone who'd spent 52 years watching her son overthink obvious solutions. Min-jae, the woman fought to preserve her community and succeeded. Now give her the tools to preserve other communities while building a business model that makes conservation profitable. His private line rang before he could respond. Simone's number triggered the familiar acceleration of pulse that had nothing to do with caffeine and everything to do with connection that transcended corporate strategy. Good morning. Her voice carried warmth that made his sterile apartment feel more like home. I wanted to thank you again for last night's speech. Mrs. Rosa has been quoting it all morning. Simone, can you come over? There are some things we need to discuss. And that sounds ominous. Good things or bad things? Min-jae glanced at his mother and Mrs. Kim, both watching his side of the conversation with expressions that suggested intervention would continue until satisfactory results were achieved. Complicated things, but potentially good, complicated instead of bad complicated. I'll be there in 30 minutes. Should I bring food that you can't taste or just bring myself? Just bring yourself. My mother brought enough food to cater a small wedding. After hanging up, Min-jae faced two women who clearly expected decisions about corporate strategy and personal relationships to align in ways that served both business interests and family satisfaction. She's coming over to discuss corporate partnership opportunities. She's coming over to find out why my mother and assistant are staging interventions in my love life and business strategy simultaneously. Park Moran smiled with satisfaction. Good. It's time she understood that joining this family means accepting responsibility for more than one man's happiness. Yama, we've been dating for a week. Min-jae, you've been looking for someone worth fighting for your entire adult life. Now that you've found her, Don't let corporate timidity prevent personal progress. Mrs. Kim began clearing dishes with the efficiency of someone who'd managed Park family dynamics for 15 years. "Sir, Ms. Harrington will be here soon. Shall I prepare the partnership proposal documents? Let's see if she's interested in the concept before we overwhelm her with corporate paperwork." But even as he spoke, Min-jae realized that his mother and Mrs. Kim had identified solutions to problems he'd been struggling to solve independently. Scaling community partnership required someone with Simone's skills and credibility. Corporate success required integration of social responsibility and profitable strategy. Personal happiness required admitting that some decisions were too important to make alone. 25 minutes later, Simone knocked on his door carrying a thermos and the bemused expression of someone who'd received interesting instructions about Saturday morning visits to billionaire penthouses. "So," she said after greeting his mother and Mrs. Kim with respectful warmth, "what kind of complicated things are we discussing?" "The kind that change everything if you say yes, and complicate everything if you say no," Min-jae replied honestly. "Simone, how would you feel about becoming Director of Community Relations for Park Industries?" She set down her thermos with the careful attention of someone buying time to process unexpected information. "Is this a real job offer, or are you trying to figure out if I can be bought like Director Choi suggested?" "It's a real job offer based on real business needs and real respect for what you've accomplished in community organizing," Park Miran answered before Min-jae could speak. "My son needs someone who understands that communities are assets worth preserving. You need resources to protect more communities than just your own. It seems like efficient mathematics." Simone looked around the penthouse apartment with its sterile beauty and expensive emptiness, then back at Min-jae's expression of hopeful anxiety. What would this job actually involve? Developing standardized procedures for community partnership in development projects. Training staff in neighborhood engagement strategies. Identifying preservation opportunities before they become crisis situations. Building relationships with community leaders across Seoul who could benefit from adaptive reuse approaches. Mrs. Kim's presentation was comprehensive and clearly pre-planned. Essentially, expanding what you accomplished in Itaewon to other neighborhoods facing similar pressures. And the personal complications? Min-jae met her eyes directly. "We'd be working together daily while figuring out whether our relationship can survive without crisis to unite us. It could strengthen what we're building, or it could destroy it through proximity and professional pressure. What do you think it would do?" "I think it would force us to discover whether we love each other enough to navigate complicated situations together," which seems like information worth having. Simone moved to his kitchen window, staring out at Seoul's endless expansion while considering decisions that would shape her professional future and personal relationships simultaneously. The silence stretched until Mrs. Kim cleared her throat with the diplomatically pointed cough of someone who'd watched Park family discussions reach decision points. "Ms. Harrington, if I may," Park Moran said gently, "love and work aren't separate categories for people who care about making the world better. Sometimes the best partnerships combine both. Mrs. Park, with respect, I've seen what happens when personal relationships get tangled up with corporate hierarchies. My divorce taught me that mixing love and business can destroy both. And my marriage taught me that separating them can prevent both from reaching their potential." Park Miran's voice carried the authority of someone who'd navigated 3 decades of business partnership with romantic partnership. The question isn't whether combining them creates complications. It's whether the complications are worth the possibilities they create. Simone turned from the window, her expression shifting from skepticism to something that might have been cautious optimism. "Min-jae, if I took this position, would I report to you? You'd report to the board through me, but with authority to make community partnership decisions independently. I don't want corporate hierarchy to compromise your community credibility. And if our personal relationship doesn't work out, then we figure out how to maintain professional partnership for the sake of communities that need protecting, regardless of our romantic compatibility." That sounds mature and rational and completely terrifying. Min-jae moved closer, close enough to see the careful consideration in her expression. The weighing of risks against possibilities that had become familiar in their short but intense relationship. "Simone, the scariest decisions are usually the ones most worth making. But I need you to choose based on what you want, not what you think I need." She kissed him then, quickly and decisively, as if sealing a contract that couldn't be negotiated through words alone. I want to save communities and see if we can save each other in the process. When do I start? Monday morning found Simone in a conference room 40 floors above Seoul, wearing a business suit that felt like costume armor, and reviewing community development files that represented her first week as Director of Community Relations. The transition from restaurant owner to corporate executive had been abrupt but necessary. Kim Development Group was moving aggressively on 6 neighborhoods, while Park Industries adapted to its new community-centered approach. The Hongdae situation is most urgent, Mrs. Kim explained, sliding photographs across the mahogany table that showed artist studios, music venues, and small cafes that had given the district its creative character. Kim Development acquired 3 properties last Friday. They're planning to demolish and replace with luxury retail complexes within 60 days. Simone studied the images, recognizing patterns she'd seen in Itaewon. Vibrant community spaces that generated cultural value, but not enough profit to compete with aggressive development. What's their legal justification? Economic revitalization. They're arguing that artist studios and music venues don't generate sufficient tax revenue to justify prime real estate usage. Min-jae entered the conference room carrying coffee and architectural surveys that looked ominously familiar. Director Choi is using the same displacement strategies he wanted to use in Itaewon, just with better legal documentation. Can we counter-offer? Propose adaptive reuse alternatives before they start demolition. We can try. But Simone, Kim Development moves faster than our community partnership process allows. They acquire, demolish, and replace within 90 days. Our approach requires months of community consultation and collaborative design. The fundamental challenge was becoming clear. Ethical development took time, while aggressive development created facts on the ground that couldn't be reversed. Park Industries' commitment to community partnership was admirable, but potentially ineffective, against competitors willing to prioritize speed over social responsibility. Then we need to speed up our process without compromising our principles, Simone said, feeling the weight of corporate responsibility settling around her shoulders like ill-fitting clothes. Mrs. Kim, can you arrange meetings with Hongdae community leaders for this afternoon? I want to understand their preservation priorities before Kim Development eliminates their options. At 2 p.m., Simone found herself in a basement cafe that looked like artistic chaos had been organized into functional beauty. Mismatched furniture, walls covered with local musicians' posters, the kind of authentic atmosphere that luxury development spent millions trying to recreate artificially. 12 community representatives sat around tables stained with coffee rings and decorated with creative ambition. Ms. Harrington, the cafe owner, introduced herself with paint-stained hands and skeptical eyes. I'm Lee Min-jung. We heard about your success in Itaewon, but Hongdae is different. We're not fighting for housing. We're fighting for the right to make art without being profitable enough to justify real estate prices. Tell me about the spaces you're trying to preserve. For 90 minutes, Simone listened to descriptions of recording studios where K-pop stars had created their first demos, galleries that had launched careers of internationally recognized artists, venues that had incubated musical genres that were now exported globally. The economic value was enormous, but dispersed across decades and difficult to quantify in ways that impressed corporate accountants. The problem, explained a photographer whose studio occupied a basement space for 1/10 of what equivalent commercial real estate would cost, is that creative communities generate cultural capital that gets converted to financial capital by developers who had nothing to do with creating the culture. Simone recognized the pattern. Neighborhoods became cool through artists' efforts. Coolness attracted commercial interest. Commercial interest raised rents beyond artists' ability to pay. Artists got displaced to make room for businesses capitalizing on culture the artists had created. Gentrification disguised as cultural appreciation. What if we could create a model that preserved affordable creative space while generating sustainable returns for property owners? You mean like artist housing cooperatives? Community-owned commercial space? I mean like treating artistic communities as economic engines that deserve infrastructure support rather than displacement threats. The concept was ambitious and complicated, using Park Industries' resources to help creative communities acquire their own real estate, then providing development services that preserved affordability while building equity for artist owners. It would require lower profit margins but longer-term community partnership relationships. Ms. Harrington. Lee Min-jung's skepticism was softening into cautious interest. What's the catch? Corporate executives don't usually offer to help artists buy property out of philanthropic impulse. The catch is that this model only works if creative communities remain stable and successful long-term. We're betting that preserving artistic neighborhoods generates more value than displacing them. But it's a long-term bet that requires trust from people who've learned not to trust developers. After the meeting, Simone called Min-jae from the cafe's back room, where acoustic guitars hung from walls covered with flyers for concerts that would never happen if Kim Development succeeded. How did the community consultation go? Complicated, but promising. Min-jae, I think we can create something innovative here, but it requires corporate investment in community ownership models. Basically, we help artists buy their own buildings instead of renting space that gets gentrified out from under them. That sounds expensive and risky. It sounds like long-term community partnership that generates sustainable returns while preserving cultural assets. Simone walked through the cafe, observing creative energy that couldn't be quantified on balance sheets, but generated value that lasted decades. But you're right. It's expensive upfront and risky if the communities don't succeed. What do you need to test the model? Board approval for community investment funding, legal framework for cooperative ownership structures, and about 6 months to see if we can help 12 artists buy their building before Kim Development eliminates the option. Min-jae was quiet for several moments, and Simone could almost hear him calculating profit margins against social impact. Set up a presentation for Thursday's board meeting. If we're going to compete with Kim Development Group's speed, we need board approval to move fast on innovative solutions. That evening, Simone worked until midnight in her new office, developing financial projections that balanced community support with corporate sustainability. The numbers were challenging but workable, if Park Industries was willing to accept reduced short-term profits for increased long-term community relationships. Her desk phone rang at 11:30 p.m. Min-jae's voice carried exhaustion that matched her own. Are you still at the office? Creating corporate arguments for preserving art communities. How do you quantify the economic value of cultural authenticity? Very carefully, and with lots of footnotes explaining long-term strategic benefits. Min-jae's laugh carried the tiredness of someone who'd spent the day translating social values into business language. Simone, can I pick you up? I have something to show you. 20 minutes later, they stood on the rooftop of Park Industries building, Seoul's neon landscape spreading below them like electrical constellations. The October air was crisp with approaching winter, the city beautiful in ways that development rarely preserved. What did you want to show me? Min-jae pointed toward the Hongdae district, where creative energy pulsed through streets that looked like scattered jewels from their 45th floor perspective. That, all of it. Seoul's creative communities that generate culture the world wants to copy. Korean innovation isn't just technological, it's cultural, artistic, musical. But we keep displacing the people who create the culture we're trying to export. And I'm tired of being part of the problem. Simone, I want Park Industries to become the company that preserves Seoul's creative communities instead of destroying them. Even if it means lower profit margins, even if it means competing with developers who prioritize efficiency over authenticity. She moved closer, close enough to feel his warmth against the evening chill. That's a beautiful sentiment, Min-jae. But sentiment doesn't pay corporate expenses or satisfy board members who measure success in quarterly earnings. Then we prove that preserving creative communities is good business. That cultural authenticity generates long-term value that demolition and replacement can't match. And if we're wrong, if our community partnership model fails and Park Industries loses market share to competitors willing to prioritize profit over people, Min-jae pulled her close, his hands framing her face with reverent attention to expressions that had become essential to his sense of possibility. Then we fail trying to build something worth succeeding at, instead of succeeding at something that destroys what we care about. They kissed with the desperation of people who discovered that love and work and social responsibility couldn't be separated into convenient categories. That caring about each other meant caring about the communities they served. And caring about communities meant accepting risks that purely financial calculations wouldn't justify. Simone, there's something else. Something I need to tell you about the board meeting Thursday. Her expression shifted to concern. What kind of something? Director Choi has requested permission to present Kim Development Group's counter-proposals for the same communities we're trying to preserve. He wants to demonstrate that aggressive development generates superior returns compared to our community partnership approach. So Thursday's meeting becomes a direct competition between our models. Thursday's meeting determines whether Park Industries commits to community partnership as core business strategy, or returns to traditional development approaches that prioritize extraction over investment. Simone looked out over Seoul's creative districts, neighborhoods where artists and musicians and writers generated culture that would either be preserved through innovative business models or eliminated through aggressive development. No pressure. None at all. Just the future of community-centered development in Seoul, our professional partnership, and possibly our personal relationship hanging in the balance. Min Jae, when you put it like that, it sounds almost manageable. They stood on the rooftop until past midnight, holding each other against the October wind and the weight of decisions that would shape communities they'd never met, but were somehow responsible for protecting. Tuesday morning exploded across Seoul's media landscape with headlines that made Min Jae's coffee taste even more flavorless than usual. Billionaire's romance influences corporate strategy, and love story or business scandal. Park Industries under scrutiny. The photographs were professionally shot, clearly the work of hired surveillance rather than casual paparazzi, showing him and Simone on the rooftop the night before, their embrace framed against Seoul's glittering skyline. Mrs. Kim entered his office with damage control urgency and a stack of morning papers that painted their relationship as everything from inspiring romance to corporate corruption. Sir, the timing suggests coordinated media strategy. These articles appeared simultaneously across 5 publications, all questioning whether personal relationships are compromising business judgment. Min Jae studied the photographs that made private moments look like public performance, recognizing Director Choi's tactical precision in the timing. 2 days before the crucial board meeting, when community partnership proposals would be evaluated alongside Kim Development Group's aggressive alternatives, their relationship had become headline news that reinforced narratives about compromised leadership. What's the corporate response strategy? We've prepared statements emphasizing Ms. Harrington's professional qualifications and the business merits of community partnership models. But sir, perception management has limits when the perception is that love influenced hiring decisions. His private line rang before he could respond. Simone's voice carried the tight control of someone who'd discovered that privacy was a luxury corporate executives couldn't afford. Have you seen the morning papers? I've seen enough. Simone, I'm sorry. I should have anticipated that our relationship would become weaponized against the community partnership programs. Min Jae, these articles make it sound like I seduced you into hiring me to prevent your company from demolishing my restaurant. Like I'm some kind of corporate black widow who destroys billionaires through strategic romance. The hurt in her voice cut deeper than any media criticism. Simone had spent 15 years building credibility as a community leader and business owner, only to have that reputation reframed as opportunistic manipulation by reporters who'd never met her, but needed scandalous narratives to sell papers. What do you need from me? How can I fix this? You can't fix media narratives, Min Jae. But you can decide whether you're willing to endure them for the sake of preserving communities and developing whatever this relationship actually is. The challenge was direct and necessary. Min Jae had inherited corporate authority, but hadn't faced personal costs that came with using that authority for social purposes rather than purely financial ones. Dating the director of community relations while implementing controversial community partnership policies created vulnerability that competitors would exploit ruthlessly. Simone, I've never cared less about media coverage or more about someone's opinion of my choices. But I need to know, are you prepared for this level of scrutiny? Because it's going to get worse before it gets better. I've been scrutinized before. Divorce proceedings, business struggles, community activism. My life has been public record multiple times. The question is whether you're prepared to date someone whose presence in your life will always be interpreted as political statement. Min Jae looked out his office windows at Seoul's expansion, development that eliminated communities in the name of progress, while generating profits that couldn't purchase the cultural authenticity being destroyed. I'm prepared to date someone whose presence in my life makes me a better leader and a better person, regardless of what corporate rivals or gossip columnists say about it. Then we go to Thursday's board meeting together and present our community partnership proposals based on their merits, not their romantic backstory. Together? Simone, that might reinforce perceptions that Min-jae, hiding our relationship won't make it disappear, meant compromised objective decision-making. The entertainment media celebrated the fairy tale elements of Billionaire Meets Chef, while ignoring the substantive policy implications. The community newsletters praised their partnership while expressing concerns about whether corporate romance could survive corporate pressures. At noon, Mrs. Kim announced an unexpected visitor. "Sir, Director Kim from your board is here. She says it's urgent." Director Kim entered with the composed concern of someone who'd spent 22 years navigating corporate politics without losing her moral compass. "President Park, I wanted to discuss Thursday's meeting privately before it becomes another media spectacle. What are your concerns?" "My concerns are that you're fighting the right battles with the wrong tactics. Community partnership is brilliant policy, but implementing it through a romantic relationship creates vulnerability that undermines the policy's credibility." Director Kim sat across from his desk with the authority of someone who'd earned respect through competence rather than inheritance. "Min-jae, I supported your adaptive reuse proposal because the business case is strong. But board members are questioning whether your judgment about Ms. Harrington's qualifications was influenced by factors other than professional competence." Director Kim, Simone's qualifications speak for themselves. Her community organizing experience, her business management skills, her cultural competency are all excellent and relevant. But Min-jae, corporate leadership requires managing perceptions as carefully as managing realities. Right now, the perception is that you created a position for someone you're romantically involved with, then developed policies that serve her community's interests. The accusation was logical and infuriating because it inverted cause and effect. Min-jae's relationship with Simone had developed because of her community leadership, not despite it. Her qualifications for Director of Community Relations were evident to anyone who'd worked with her. But corporate politics operated on appearances rather than evidence when appearances served competitive purposes. What do you recommend? I recommend separating personal and professional decisions until the community partnership model proves itself successful. Date Ms. Harrington, but don't make corporate decisions that benefit her directly until the relationship has been established long enough to demonstrate stability. Director Kim, with respect, that approach assumes that personal relationships compromise professional judgment rather than clarify it. What if being involved with someone who understands community development makes me a better leader rather than a compromised one? Then you'll need to prove that to board members who've been trained to view emotional involvement as corporate liability rather than corporate asset. That evening, Min-jae met Simone at Soul Food after closing time. The restaurant quiet, except for the lingering aromas of meals shared by families who'd become communities through the simple act of eating together. She was reviewing financial projections for Thursday's presentation, her concentration so complete that she didn't notice him watching from the doorway. "How are the numbers looking?" Simone glanced up with the exhausted satisfaction of someone who'd spent hours translating social values into business language. "Complicated but compelling. The artist cooperative model generates 15% lower returns than traditional development in the first 5 years, but 30% higher returns over 20 years due to cultural tourism and creative industry development. That's actually impressive. It's sustainable development that treats communities as long-term investments rather than short-term opportunities." She set down her calculator with the decisive motion of someone who'd reached important conclusions. "Min-jae, I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly. Always. Do you think the board will approve community partnership funding because the policy makes sense, or because you're sleeping with the person who's advocating for it?" The question hit like cold water, forcing Min-jae to confront the same concerns that Director Kim had raised with more diplomatic language. Corporate decisions made for personal reasons created precedents that undermined institutional integrity, even when those decisions served social purposes. I think the board will approve community partnership funding because the financial projections demonstrate sustainable profitability combined with positive social impact. But Simone, I can't guarantee that some members won't question the relationship between policy and personal motivation. And if they do question it, if they suggest that I'm using romantic manipulation to influence corporate strategy, then I'll remind them that you were advocating for community preservation before we met, and that falling in love with someone who fights for what she believes in doesn't invalidate either her beliefs or my business judgment. Simone moved around the table to sit beside him, close enough that he could smell the lingering sense of cooking that clung to her hair and clothes, garlic and hope, and the satisfaction of feeding people who mattered. Min-jae, there's something I need to tell you about the media coverage today. What kind of something? 3 journalists called Soul Food this afternoon. They wanted to interview me about our relationship, about the community partnership programs, about whether I'm using personal influence to advance political agendas. What did you tell them? I told them that my professional qualifications existed before our personal relationship, and that anyone interested in evaluating community partnership policies should examine their effectiveness rather than speculating about the romantic lives of the people implementing them. That sounds diplomatic and appropriate. It sounds like what I had to say to protect both of our credibilities. But Min-jae, I also told them that I'd rather be questioned for fighting to preserve communities than praised for staying silent while they get destroyed. She kissed him then, with the determination of someone who decided that some battles were worth fighting, regardless of their personal cost. The kiss tasted like possibility and defiance, like the courage to build something meaningful, even when that meant accepting scrutiny from people who'd never risked anything for causes larger than their own comfort. Thursday's presentation will determine whether Park Industries becomes the kind of company that preserves Seoul's cultural communities or returns to traditional development that eliminates them. Simone said against his lips. Win or lose, we'll face it together. 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 Because Min-jae, love that can't survive corporate boardrooms probably isn't strong enough to survive anything else either. Outside, Seoul's neon lights reflected off windows that framed conversations about romance and business strategy, personal commitment and professional risk. The possibility that some relationships were worth defending in public even when privacy would have been safer and simpler. Thursday's board meeting was 18 hours away, and Min-jae finally understood that the choice wasn't between love and business success. It was between building something worth celebrating and achieving victories that felt hollow without someone to share them with. Thursday morning arrived with unseasonable clarity, Seoul's autumn sky bright and unforgiving as Min-jae and Simone prepared for the board meeting that would determine Park Industries' future direction, and inevitably, their relationship's sustainability under corporate pressure. The media attention had intensified overnight. 3 news vans were parked outside Park Industries' building, and reporters with expensive cameras waited in the lobby like sharks sensing blood in corporate waters. Sir, Mrs. Kim briefed them in the elevator ascending to the boardroom. Director Choi arrived 30 minutes ago with 4 Kim Development Group executives and a presentation that runs 67 slides. He's requested equal time to demonstrate alternative approaches to the same community development challenges. Simone checked her own presentation materials one final time. 23 slides that balanced financial projections with social impact data, architectural renderings that showed preserved neighborhoods integrated with sustainable development, testimonials from community leaders who'd participated in adaptive reuse planning. Compared to Choi's corporate firepower, their approach looked modest but authentic. How many board members are confirmed attending? All 7, plus Mayor Kim as observer and 3 city council representatives interested in municipal development policy implications. Mrs. Kim's voice carried the weight of someone who'd organized meetings that shaped corporate destiny for 15 years. Sir, the room will be crowded and the attention intense. Every decision will be scrutinized for months. The boardroom occupied the 45th floor with panoramic views of Seoul's relentless expansion, neighborhoods being demolished and replaced with glass towers that generated profits but eliminated the cultural character that had made those neighborhoods worth developing. 7 board members sat around the mahogany table, their expressions ranging from supportive to skeptical to carefully neutral. Director Choi stood at the presentation screen with 4 colleagues who looked like they'd been hired specifically to intimidate community partnership advocates. Their suits were more expensive, their briefcases more imposing, their confidence more polished than anything Park Industries could deploy in defense of adaptive reuse policies. Ladies and gentlemen, Choi began his presentation with slides that showed profit margins, construction timelines, and market comparisons that made aggressive development look financially superior to community partnership approaches. Kim Development Group's analysis demonstrates clear advantages of efficiency over accommodation in Seoul's competitive real estate market. For 40 minutes, Choi presented data that made Park Industries' community partnership model look expensive, slow, and naive, compared to traditional development that prioritized speed and profit over social considerations. His arguments were logical, his numbers impressive, his conclusion inevitable. Community-centered development was a luxury that Seoul's market couldn't afford. The Hongdae example illustrates these principles clearly, Choi continued, showing photographs of artist studios and music venues that Kim Development had already acquired for demolition. Preserving low-revenue creative spaces prevents optimal land utilization that could generate 5 times current tax revenue through luxury retail development. Min-jae watched board members' expressions as Choi's presentation progressed, noting how financial logic seemed to override social considerations when presented with corporate-quality visual aids and professional confidence. Even Director Kim, who'd supported adaptive reuse previously, looked concerned about profit margin comparisons that made community partnership seem financially irresponsible. Director Choi, board member Wu from Hong Kong Operations, interrupted. What timeline does Kim Development Group project for Hongdae redevelopment completion? 18 months from acquisition to full occupancy, with projected returns of 43% above current neighborhood revenue generation. And what provision does your model make for displaced creative communities? Relocation assistance equal to 6 months' rent in comparable spaces, plus priority consideration for employment in new retail developments that require cultural authenticity, but can afford commercial rent rates. The answer was technically generous while being practically meaningless. Artists couldn't afford commercial rent rates, and retail employment wouldn't replace creative community infrastructure that had taken decades to develop organically. Thank you, Director Choi, Min-jae said when the presentation concluded. Ms. Harrington and I will now present Park Industries' community partnership alternative. Simone stood with the composed authority of someone who'd spent 15 years building credibility through results rather than presentation skills. Her first slide showed the same Hongdae artist studios, but with annotations explaining their economic impact. Recording studios that had produced internationally successful K-pop albums, galleries that had launched artists now represented in major museums, venues that had incubated musical genres exported globally. Ladies and gentlemen, the question isn't whether creative communities generate revenue, Simone began, her voice carrying conviction that transcended corporate formality. The question is whether we're measuring revenue comprehensively enough to understand what we're actually destroying when we prioritize short-term development profits over long-term cultural assets. Her presentation demonstrated how artist communities created cultural capital that generated tourism revenue, attracted international business investment, and established Seoul's reputation as a creative hub that justified premium pricing for Korean cultural exports. The economic impact was enormous, but distributed across multiple sectors rather than concentrated in real estate development profits. The cooperative ownership model we're proposing allows artists to build equity in their creative spaces while preserving affordable rents that keep communities intact, Simone explained, showing architectural plans that integrated affordable artist housing with market-rate residential development. Park Industries provides development expertise and initial investment. Communities provide cultural authenticity and long-term stability, and the combination generates sustainable returns that increase over time as neighborhoods become more established. Min-jae took over the presentation's financial section, demonstrating how community partnership generated lower initial returns, but higher long-term profitability through reduced tenant turnover, increased property values driven by cultural tourism, and municipal incentives for developments that preserved neighborhood character. The business case is compelling, Min-jae concluded, but the strategic case is more important. Seoul competes globally by offering cultural authenticity that other cities can't replicate. Preserving the communities that create that authenticity isn't social charity. It's protecting competitive advantages that generate value across multiple industries. The boardroom was quiet for several moments after their presentation ended. 7 board members studied financial projections that showed community partnership could be profitable while preserving cultural assets, but at the cost of accepting reduced short-term returns that traditional development models wouldn't require. Ms. Harrington, board member Chen from Shanghai Operations, spoke first. Your community consultation process sounds thorough, but how do you ensure that artist communities remain financially sustainable long-term? What prevents cooperative ownership from becoming subsidized housing that requires ongoing corporate support? Cooperative ownership creates equity-building incentives that rental models don't provide, Simone replied. Artists who own their creative spaces invest in maintaining and improving those spaces because they benefit directly from increased property values. The model becomes self-sustaining as communities develop economic stability through equity ownership, rather than remaining dependent on external support. Director Choi, board member Park from construction, addressed Min Jae's former colleague. Kim Development Group's timeline shows completion in 18 months, while Park Industries' community partnership model requires 36 months for comparable development. How do you justify the efficiency difference? Community consultation takes time, Choi answered. But the consultation process often reveals community resistance that delays construction, generates legal challenges, and increases costs beyond initial projections. Our model eliminates those complications through decisive action that prevents organized opposition. By eliminating communities before they can organize opposition, Simone interjected, her professional composure slipping slightly. That's not efficiency. That's avoiding accountability for development impacts on people who can't afford legal representation. The exchange shifted the boardroom's atmosphere from professional courtesy to ideological conflict, making clear that the choice between development models represented fundamental disagreement about corporate responsibility and community rights. Director Kim from Operations, whose vote had been decisive in previous meetings, asked the question that everyone was avoiding. President Park, Ms. Harrington, your personal relationship has been the subject of considerable media attention. How do board members evaluate policy proposals when the advocates are romantically involved? The question hung in the room like smoke, poisoning strategic discussion with implications of compromised judgment and corporate impropriety. Min Jae felt the trap's final spring. Their relationship had become the lens through which every decision would be viewed, every choice questioned. Director Kim, Min Jae answered, with the authority that had intimidated competitors for 8 years. Personal relationships don't compromise professional judgment when those relationships are based on shared values and mutual respect. My involvement with Ms. Harrington developed because of her community leadership, not despite it. Her qualifications for Director of Community Relations are evident to anyone who examines her work rather than speculating about our personal lives. And the timing? Chen pressed. Ms. Harrington's hiring immediately preceded policy proposals that directly benefit communities she's advocated for. How do we separate professional merit from personal motivation? You examine results, Simone said firmly. Community partnership policies succeed or fail based on their effectiveness, not on the personal relationships of the people implementing them. If preserving creative communities generates sustainable returns while maintaining cultural authenticity, those results validate the approach regardless of who's advocating for it. The board vote was called at 3 p.m. after 2 hours of discussion that had covered financial projections, development timelines, community impact assessments, and the unavoidable question of whether romance had influenced corporate strategy in ways that compromised institutional integrity. 4 board members voted to approve community partnership funding and authorize Park Industries' artist cooperative development in Hongdae. 2 voted against, favoring Kim Development Group's traditional approach. The deciding vote belonged to Director Kim from Operations, a woman who'd supported Min Jae's leadership through previous challenges, but had expressed concerns about mixing personal and professional decision-making. This company has always balanced profitability with social responsibility, Director Kim said quietly. President Park's community partnership model continues that tradition while adapting to modern urban development challenges. I vote to approve the Hongdae Artist Cooperative Project and authorize expanded community partnership funding. The room erupted in polite applause that felt like relief rather than celebration. 4 votes for community partnership, 3 against. Min-jae had won by the same narrow margin that had preserved his leadership previously, but the close vote demonstrated that corporate conscience remained vulnerable to competitive pressure and financial skepticism. Very well, Director Wu acknowledged with professional acceptance of democratic process. Park Industries will proceed with community partnership development in Hongdae, with quarterly review of financial performance and community impact metrics. But as board members filed out with expressions ranging from supportive to resentful, Min-jae understood that winning had required political skill rather than policy merit alone. The community partnership model would succeed or fail based on financial performance over the next 18 months, and any failure would be attributed to leadership compromised by romantic involvement rather than strategic miscalculation. Outside the boardroom windows, Seoul's creative districts pulsed with energy that would either be preserved through innovative business models or eliminated through aggressive development. Artists and musicians and writers continued creating culture that the world wanted to copy, unaware that their survival had been determined by a board vote that measured their value in quarterly earnings and long-term strategic benefits. "So," Simone said, as they walked through Park Industries' lobby past reporters who'd been waiting hours for results. "We won. We won the right to prove that community partnership can be profitable," Min-jae replied. "Now comes the hard part, actually making it work. Together. Together. Because Simone, if we're going to change how development works in Seoul, we'll need to prove that love and business success aren't mutually exclusive. They're mutually reinforcing when both are based on values worth defending. The media attention would continue, the corporate pressure would intensify, and the financial performance would be scrutinized quarterly. But for the first time in 3 years, Min-jae felt hungry for challenges that mattered more than profit margins. And for the first time in months, Simone felt hopeful that communities could be preserved through innovation rather than eliminated through indifference. Thursday's victory tasted like possibility, even for a man who'd forgotten how to taste anything else. 6 months later, Seoul's spring air carried cherry blossom petals and the scent of change as Min-jae walked through Hongdae's preserved artist district, where cooperative ownership had transformed creative spaces from vulnerable rental properties into community-owned cultural assets. The adaptive reuse project had exceeded financial projections by 18%, while maintaining the neighborhood's authentic character that attracted both local residents and international tourists. "The recording studio cooperative is booked solid through December," Simone reported, reviewing occupancy data on her tablet as they toured spaces that Kim Development Group would have demolished for luxury retail complexes. 3 K-pop albums recorded here have topped international charts, and the studio owners are earning enough to expand into the adjacent building. Min-jae observed artists who'd become property owners, working in spaces they'd helped design, noting how ownership incentives had motivated investment in soundproofing, equipment upgrades, and aesthetic improvements that rental arrangements wouldn't have justified. The cooperative model was generating community stability while producing measurable economic returns. What about the Gallery Cooperative? Membership waiting list of 47 artists, with exhibition space booked 18 months in advance. They've established a relationship with the Seoul Museum of Contemporary Art for emerging artist showcases, and property values in the surrounding blocks have increased 12% due to cultural tourism. The success was gratifying, but complicated. Other neighborhoods facing development pressure had requested Park Industries' assistance with similar community partnership projects. But scaling the model required resources and staff that strained corporate capacity while reducing profit margins that board members monitored carefully. "Mrs. Kim called this morning," Min-jae mentioned, as they walked past cafes where artists gathered to discuss projects that combined creative ambition with sustainable business practices. The Insadong development proposal has been approved by the City Planning Commission. 6-block traditional district, 73 small businesses, most operating in buildings over 50 years old. Traditional development or community partnership? That depends on whether we can demonstrate that preserving cultural authenticity generates sustainable returns in tourist-focused commercial districts. Simone stopped walking, her attention captured by implications that went beyond single neighborhood preservation. Min-jae, Insadong isn't just any traditional district. It's the heart of Seoul's traditional arts and crafts community. If we can develop community partnership models that work for cultural tourism districts, we could establish proof of concept that changes how traditional neighborhoods get developed citywide. They'd been working together professionally for 6 months, and their collaboration had evolved into patterns that combined personal intimacy with shared mission in ways that strengthened both. Board members who'd initially questioned their relationship had grown to appreciate results that vindicated community partnership approaches while generating acceptable profit margins. That afternoon, they met with Insadong community leaders in a traditional tea house that occupied a hanok building from the Joseon dynasty, its wooden beams darkened with age, and its paper windows filtering afternoon light into patterns that photography couldn't capture, but tourists spent fortunes trying to experience. Mr. Park, Ms. Harrington, the tea house owner, introduced herself with the formal politeness that traditional Korean business relationships required. I am Mrs. Cho Eun-jung. We have observed your work in Hongdae with interest, but Insadong presents different challenges than artist communities. What kinds of challenges? Our businesses serve cultural tourism that requires authenticity tourists cannot find in modern shopping districts. But authentic traditional crafts, pottery, calligraphy, traditional music instruments, cannot compete with imported mass production on price alone. Mrs. Cho poured tea with ritual precision that transformed simple beverage service into cultural performance worth preserving. Tourists pay premium prices for authentic experiences, but landlords prefer tenants who can afford commercial rent rates regardless of cultural contribution. The challenge was familiar but nuanced. Insadong's traditional businesses generated significant tourist revenue for Seoul's economy, but rental costs were driving authentic craftspeople out of the district in favor of shops selling mass-produced traditional items manufactured cheaply elsewhere. What if craftspeople could own their workshop spaces instead of renting them? Simone suggested. Cooperative ownership models that preserve affordability while building equity for traditional artists. Cooperative ownership sounds beneficial, but traditional craftspeople are elderly, with limited financial resources for property acquisition. Many families have operated workshops for generations, but never owned the buildings where they work. Min-jae studied the tea house interior, noting details that required decades of careful maintenance. Wooden floors polished smooth by generations of customers, paper screens replaced seasonally, traditional heating systems that created ambiance impossible to replicate artificially. Mrs. Cho, what if Park Industries could facilitate ownership transfers at below-market rates, with long-term payment plans that traditional businesses could afford? That would require considerable financial commitment from your company with uncertain returns. Not uncertain, different. Instead of maximizing short-term development profits, we'd be investing in long-term cultural tourism infrastructure that benefits Seoul's international reputation. For 2 hours, they discussed financial structures that would allow traditional craftspeople to purchase their workshop spaces through extended payment plans subsidized by Park Industries' development profits from compatible tourist-focused businesses in the same district. The model would work, Mrs. Cho concluded, if the city provides tax incentives for cultural preservation, tourists continue paying premium prices for authentic experiences, and Park Industries accepts reduced immediate profits for sustainable community investment. All of which are achievable if we can demonstrate that preserved traditional districts generate more economic value than generic commercial developments. After the meeting, Min-jae and Simone walked through Insadong's narrow alleys, past workshops where elderly craftspeople created pottery and calligraphy and traditional musical instruments with skills that had been refined across generations. The cultural authenticity was palpable, but economically vulnerable to development pressures that prioritized extraction over investment. Simone, if we commit to the Insadong project, we're essentially betting Park Industries' reputation on the proposition that cultural preservation is good business long-term. And if we don't commit, we're accepting that Seoul's traditional districts will be eliminated for commercial developments that generate profits while destroying the cultural assets that made those districts worth developing. They paused outside a traditional instrument workshop where an elderly craftsman was teaching 2 teenagers how to construct gaegeum, traditional Korean zithers that required months to complete properly, but could be imported from China for 1/10 the handmade price. Look at that. Simone pointed to the intergenerational teaching happening through the workshop window. That's cultural transmission that can't be quantified in quarterly earnings, but generates value for decades. It's also cultural transmission that disappears if the craftsman gets displaced by commercial rent increases. Min Jae's phone buzzed with a text from Mrs. Kim. Sir, urgent board meeting requested by Director Woo. Kim Development Group has made acquisition offers for 4 Insadong properties. Community leaders are requesting Park Industries' response. The competition had accelerated while they were developing partnership proposals. Kim Development Group was moving to acquire properties before Park Industries could establish community ownership structures, forcing immediate decisions about corporate commitment to traditional district preservation. What does the text say? Simone asked, noting his expression. Kim Development Group is acquiring Insadong properties. The board wants an emergency meeting about our response. When? Tomorrow morning. Simone, this is it. The moment we find out whether Park Industries is committed to community partnership as core business strategy, or whether board support was limited to small-scale experimental projects. That evening, they worked until past midnight in Min Jae's penthouse, developing financial projections that demonstrated how traditional district preservation could generate sustainable returns through cultural tourism, premium pricing for authentic experiences, and municipal incentives for cultural asset protection. The numbers work, Simone concluded, reviewing calculations that balanced community affordability with corporate profitability. But they require 18-month implementation timelines and board commitment to accepting reduced short-term profits, both of which are challenging when Kim Development Group can complete acquisition and redevelopment in 6 months with higher immediate returns. Min Jae, some things can't be rebuilt once they're demolished. If Insadong gets converted to generic commercial space, Seoul loses traditional cultural infrastructure that took centuries to develop organically. They stood on his balcony overlooking Seoul's expansion. The city's traditional districts, visible as pockets of lower buildings surrounded by glass towers that generated profits, but eliminated the cultural character that distinguished Seoul from other international cities. Tomorrow's board meeting determines whether Park Industries becomes the company that preserves Seoul's cultural heritage or returns to development models that treat communities as obstacles to eliminate. No pressure, Simone said, echoing their conversation from months earlier when everything had felt less certain but somehow simpler. None at all. Just the future of traditional Korean culture hanging in the balance. But as they held each other against the April wind and the weight of decisions that would affect communities they were still learning to understand, Min Jae realized that hunger for meaningful work had gradually replaced his appetite for everything else, including the ability to taste food that had returned so gradually, he'd barely noticed its restoration. Simone, he said suddenly, what did you put in that tea Mrs. Cho served this afternoon? Traditional green tea with honey. Why? Because I could taste it. Sweet, earthy, subtle. Min Jae paused, wonder dawning slowly. I could actually taste it. Simone's smile carried joy that transcended corporate strategy and community preservation battles. Your adjusia is improving? My adjusia is gone. Completely. When did food start having flavor again? Maybe when you started feeding your soul along with your ambition. They kissed with the excitement of people who discovered that some appetites returned when life became worth savoring again. And Min Jae finally understood that the ability to taste had been waiting not for medical intervention, but for reasons to find life delicious beyond corporate achievement. Tomorrow's board meeting would determine Park Industries' commitment to cultural preservation, but tonight felt like victory regardless of whatever corporate battles lay ahead. The emergency board meeting convened Friday morning with urgency that reflected millions of won in Insadong real estate transactions occurring while Park Industries debated community partnership commitments. Kim Development Group had acquired 6 properties overnight, forcing immediate decisions about whether traditional district preservation justified accepting reduced profit margins when competitors prioritized efficiency over cultural authenticity. Ladies and gentlemen, Director Woo began with financial reports that made community partnership look expensive compared to Kim Development Group's aggressive acquisition strategy. We face a fundamental choice about Park Industries' development philosophy. Do we compete for market share through efficient traditional methods, or do we continue experimental social programs that may not generate sustainable returns? Min Jae studied board members' expressions, noting skepticism that hadn't been evident 6 months earlier when Hongdae artist cooperatives had seemed like manageable pilot projects. Scaling community partnership to traditional districts required investment levels that tested corporate commitment to social responsibility beyond comfortable experimentation. Director Wu, Min Jae replied, "Community partnership isn't experimental social programming. It's strategic investment in Seoul's competitive advantages as an international cultural destination. Traditional districts like Insadong generate tourism revenue that benefits multiple industries, not just real estate development. But President Park, tourism revenue doesn't appear on Park Industries' balance sheets. We can't justify reduced corporate profits based on economic benefits that other businesses capture." Simone stood with documents that represented months of research into cultural tourism's economic impact on Seoul's municipal revenue, hotel occupancy rates, restaurant sales, and international reputation as a destination worth visiting specifically for authentic cultural experiences. Director Wu, with respect, Park Industries benefits significantly from Seoul's reputation as a cultural tourism destination. Simone presented data that connected preserved traditional districts to increased property values citywide, premium pricing for developments marketed as culturally authentic, and municipal incentives for companies that supported cultural asset protection. "The question," she continued, "isn't whether cultural preservation generates revenue. It's whether we're measuring that revenue comprehensively enough to understand what we lose when traditional districts get converted to generic commercial space." Director Kim from Operations, whose support had been crucial in previous votes, raised concerns that reflected growing board skepticism about community partnership models. "Ms. Harrington, your analysis is thorough, but cultural tourism revenue projections are speculative compared to immediate development profits that Kim Development Group is offering through property acquisition." Director Kim, immediate development profits are also speculative if they depend on eliminating the cultural authenticity that attracts premium-paying tourists to Seoul instead of other Asian cities with comparable shopping and dining options. The debate continued for 2 hours, with board members questioning whether Park Industries could maintain competitive market position while implementing development approaches that prioritized community preservation over profit maximization. Financial projections supported community partnership in theory, but practical implementation required sustained commitment during 18-month development cycles, when competitors could achieve faster returns through traditional demolition and replacement. At 11 a.m., Mrs. Kim knocked with the composed urgency that signaled significant complications. "Sir, there's been a development. Mrs. Rosa from the Itaewon community has requested permission to address the board meeting. She says it's regarding historical documents that affect multiple development projects." Min Jae felt familiar tension in his stomach. Mrs. Rosa's interventions had been crucial in preserving the Itaewon community, but her timing suggested complications that could either support or undermine community partnership arguments. "Send her in." Mrs. Rosa entered the boardroom with dignity that commanded attention despite her simple dress and weathered hands, carrying a leather portfolio that looked like it contained documents preserved across decades. 7 board members watched with curiosity as she positioned herself at the presentation screen with authority that transcended corporate hierarchy. "Ladies and gentlemen, I am Rosa Gonzalez. Some of you know me from the Itaewon Preservation Campaign. Today I bring information about Seoul's traditional districts that affects all your development projects." She opened her portfolio with ritual precision, revealing documents that looked professionally restored despite their obvious age. These are property records from 1953 to 1987, documenting land ownership and cultural designation for 6 traditional districts, including Insadong, Bukchon, and areas of Itaewon. Mrs. Rosa spread the documents across the conference table with movements that spoke of long experience managing precious materials. "My late husband worked for the city planning office during Seoul's reconstruction period. Before he died, he gave me these copies because he believed someday developers would need to understand what they were building on." Min Jae studied documents that showed property boundaries, cultural heritage designations, and municipal agreements that apparently hadn't been included in modern development permit applications. "Mrs. Rosa, what do these records indicate?" "They indicate that traditional districts have legal protection under cultural preservation laws that were never officially rescinded, only forgotten by planning offices that prioritize development speed over historical compliance. Director Chen from Shanghai Operations leaned forward with the sharp attention of someone who recognized potential legal complications. Are you suggesting that current development permits may be invalid due to historical preservation requirements? I am suggesting that developers who ignore cultural heritage obligations may face legal challenges that delay construction for years, while courts determine compliance with preservation laws that remain technically active. The implications rippled through the boardroom like cold water. If Mrs. Rosa's documents were authentic and legally significant, aggressive development in traditional districts could be challenged through courts that might prioritize cultural preservation over corporate efficiency. Simone moved to examine the documents with expertise gained through months of researching community legal protections. Mrs. Rosa, these property records show cultural heritage designations for buildings that Kim Development Group has acquired for demolition. Correct. And cultural heritage designations require municipal approval for any structural modifications, including demolition. Approval that must consider cultural impact alongside economic benefit. Director Wu's expression shifted from skepticism to concern as legal implications became clearer. Mrs. Gonzalez, if these documents are legally valid, they could affect not just Kim Development Group projects, but any traditional district development that hasn't obtained proper cultural heritage clearances. Which is why, Mrs. Rosa said with satisfaction, community partnership models that preserve cultural authenticity serve legal compliance alongside social responsibility. Min-jae realized that Mrs. Rosa had provided strategic ammunition that transformed community partnership from experimental social policy into corporate risk management. Development approaches that preserve traditional districts would avoid legal challenges that could delay or eliminate projects that ignored cultural heritage requirements. Mrs. Rosa, he asked carefully, how long have you known about these legal protections? 40 years. But Senor Min-jae, knowledge is only useful when people are ready to understand its importance. 6 months ago, your board was not ready. Today, with Kim Development Group forcing immediate decisions about traditional district preservation, perhaps you are ready to appreciate what community partnership actually protects. The board vote was postponed pending legal review of Mrs. Rosa's documents, but the cultural heritage implications had shifted strategic calculations in ways that made community partnership look like prudent risk management rather than expensive social experimentation. Mrs. Rosa, Simone asked as the meeting concluded, why didn't you share these documents earlier? Because, Mija, timing matters in business as much as cooking. Reveal ingredients too early, and people don't appreciate their flavor. Wait until the right moment, and suddenly everyone understands why those ingredients were essential. That evening, Min-jae and Simone had dinner at Soul Food, the restaurant quiet, except for regular customers who'd become extended family through shared meals and mutual support during the neighborhood preservation campaign. The menu had expanded to include dishes that reflected Seoul's multicultural communities, Korean-Mexican fusion from Mrs. Rosa's collaboration, Filipino-inspired banchan from the construction workers who'd helped renovate the community kitchen, Brazilian-Korean desserts that celebrated diversity rather than assimilation. Mrs. Rosa's documents change everything, Simone observed, tasting a soup that combined her grandmother's gumbo recipe with Korean ingredients in ways that honored both culinary traditions. If traditional districts have legal heritage protection, community partnership becomes compliance strategy instead of social policy. It also means that Kim Development Group's aggressive acquisition could backfire spectacularly if cultural heritage requirements delay their projects for years. Min-jae lifted his spoon, savoring flavors that registered clearly on his restored palate. Complexity that came from combining ingredients thoughtfully, rather than overwhelming individual tastes with excessive seasoning. His ajuzia had disappeared so gradually he'd barely noticed its absence until complex flavors returned with intensity that made every meal feel celebratory. Simone, can I ask you something personal? After everything we've been through, I think personal questions are permitted. Do you ever regret getting involved with someone whose corporate battles became your daily reality? She considered the question seriously, while observing families at nearby tables, children practicing homework, while parents discussed community organizing, teenagers planning creative projects that combined artistic ambition with social responsibility. Min-jae, falling in love with you meant falling in love with the possibility of changing how business affects communities. If your corporate battles are preserving neighborhoods like this one, then they're battles worth fighting regardless of their personal cost. And if we fail, if the board ultimately decides that community partnership is too expensive or legally complicated to sustain, then we'll have proven that some people are willing to fight for communities even when fighting requires sacrifice. That's not failure. That's demonstration that Seoul has leaders who prioritize people over pure profit. They finished dinner as spring rain began pattering against windows that framed conversations about love and business strategy, personal commitment and professional risk, the satisfaction that came from building something meaningful together rather than achieving individual success in isolation. Min-jae, there's something I need to tell you about my conversation with Mrs. Rosa after the board meeting. What kind of something? She wants us to cater her granddaughter's wedding next month. Traditional Korean ceremony combined with Mexican celebration, 200 guests, fusion menu that honors both cultural traditions. That sounds wonderful. What's the complication? The granddaughter is marrying Director Kim's nephew. Our community partner relationships are about to become extended family obligations. Min-jae laughed with the relief of someone who'd discovered that success sometimes came through unexpected connections rather than strategic planning. So we're not just preserving communities, we're joining them. We're proving that business partnerships can become personal relationships, and personal relationships can strengthen business partnerships, as long as everyone involved cares more about building something meaningful than protecting individual advantages. Outside, Seoul's spring rain washed winter dust from streets where community preservation had succeeded through collaboration between corporate resources and neighborhood wisdom, between professional expertise and cultural knowledge, between falling in love and learning to fight for causes worth defending together. Monday's board meeting would determine Park Industries' long-term commitment to community partnership. But tonight felt like victory regardless of whatever corporate challenges remained ahead. The Seoul Municipal Court hearing convened on a Tuesday morning that would determine whether cultural heritage protections applied to traditional districts facing development pressure. Mrs. Rosa's documents had triggered legal review that suspended all major construction permits pending judicial clarification of preservation requirements versus development rights. Min-jae sat beside Simone in the gallery, reserved for interested parties, watching proceedings that would affect not just their community partnership projects, but Seoul's approach to cultural preservation citywide. Kim Development Group occupied the front row with 6 attorneys who'd been arguing for 2 hours that cultural heritage designations from the 1950s couldn't supersede modern economic development needs. Your Honor, Kim Development Group's lead counsel argued with the polished confidence of someone who'd won similar cases through legal technicalities. Cultural preservation cannot be allowed to prevent economic progress that benefits Seoul's entire population through increased tax revenue and modernized commercial infrastructure. Judge Park Sung-min listened with the careful attention of someone who understood that legal decisions often determined community survival beyond their immediate juridical scope. Counselor, cultural heritage law exists specifically to balance economic development with preservation of cultural assets that generate long-term value for Seoul's international reputation. But, Your Honor, the documents presented by Ms. Gonzalez represent administrative designations from Reconstruction period bureaucracy, not formal cultural heritage protections that would require current legal compliance. Mrs. Rosa sat in the witness section with dignity that commanded courtroom respect, despite her simple dress and calloused hands. When called to testify, she approached the witness stand with documents that had been professionally authenticated by 3 independent historical specialists. Mrs. Gonzalez, the judge addressed her with formal courtesy. Please explain these documents' significance for the court. Your Honor, these records show that Seoul's traditional districts were designated for cultural protection during the Reconstruction period, with requirements that any major modifications preserve neighborhood character that serves municipal tourism and cultural heritage interests. She opened her leather portfolio with ritual precision, presenting evidence that had been organized by someone who understood bureaucratic procedures despite lacking formal legal training. My husband worked for city planning for 37 years. He kept these copies because he believed developers would eventually need to understand historical obligations that modern permit offices had forgotten. And these obligations would apply to current development projects in traditional districts. Yes, Your Honor. Any construction that alters neighborhood character requires cultural impact assessment and municipal approval that considers heritage preservation alongside economic benefit. Kim Development Group's attorney cross-examined with questions designed to undermine Mrs. Rosa's credibility and the document's legal validity, but her responses demonstrated knowledge that came from decades of living in traditional districts and helping her husband navigate bureaucratic requirements for community development projects. Mrs. Gonzalez, you're not a legal professional or urban planning expert. How can this court rely on your interpretation of complex municipal regulations? Sir, I am a community member who has lived in traditional districts for 43 years, raised 7 children in buildings that developers want to demolish, and watched neighborhoods change through development that preserved character versus development that eliminated it. I may not be a legal expert, but I am an expert in what these regulations were designed to protect. The answer resonated through the courtroom with authority that transcended professional credentials, demonstrating knowledge that came from lived experience rather than academic study. Park Industries' legal team, led by attorney Kyungrae Soh, who specialized in cultural heritage law, presented arguments that supported Mrs. Rosa's documentation, while demonstrating how community partnership development could satisfy both legal preservation requirements and economic development goals. Your Honor, Park Industries' adaptive reuse projects in Hongdae demonstrate that cultural heritage compliance generates sustainable economic returns while preserving neighborhood authenticity that attracts premium-paying tourists and residents. Attorney Kim presented financial data showing how preserved traditional districts generated higher long-term property values, increased municipal tax revenue through cultural tourism, and created stable commercial environments that supported local businesses alongside international investment. The choice isn't between cultural preservation and economic development. It's between short-term extraction that eliminates cultural assets versus long-term investment that preserves competitive advantages Seoul cannot replicate through generic commercial construction. The hearing continued for 6 hours, with expert witnesses testifying about cultural heritage law, urban planning specialists explaining adaptive reuse benefits, and community representatives describing how preservation approaches affected daily life in traditional districts. At 4 p.m., Judge Park called for final arguments before rendering his decision. Your Honor, Kim Development Group's attorney made one last attempt to frame cultural preservation as economic obstruction. Seoul cannot afford to let sentimental attachment to old buildings prevent progress that generates employment, tax revenue, and modernized infrastructure for growing metropolitan population. Your Honor, Attorney Kim responded for Park Industries and community interests, Seoul cannot afford to eliminate cultural authenticity that distinguishes it from other Asian cities competing for international business investment and tourism revenue. Preserved traditional districts are economic assets, not obstacles to progress. Judge Park deliberated for 20 minutes before delivering his ruling from the bench, his words carrying implications that would shape Seoul's development approach for decades. This court finds that cultural heritage designations from Seoul's reconstruction period remain legally valid and require compliance from current development projects in traditional districts. However, compliance does not require preventing all development. It requires that development preserve cultural character while generating economic benefit. The courtroom stirred with recognition that the ruling supported both community preservation and responsible development, creating legal framework for approaches that balanced heritage protection with economic progress. Kim Development Group's planned demolitions in Insadong and Hongdae cannot proceed without cultural impact assessments and municipal approval for preservation-compatible alternatives. Park Industries' community partnership model demonstrates compliance approaches that satisfy both legal requirements and economic development goals. Min-jae felt relief flood through him as the judge's words validated everything they'd been fighting to achieve. Simone's hand found his with the natural intimacy of people who'd discovered that professional partnership strengthened personal connection rather than complicating it. Furthermore, Judge Park continued, this court recommends that Seoul municipal government establish formal procedures for cultural heritage compliance that provide clear guidelines for developers while protecting traditional districts that serve tourism and cultural preservation interests. The ruling was complete victory for community partnership approaches and legal validation of Mrs. Rosa's documentation. Kim Development Group's aggressive acquisition strategy had backfired spectacularly, leaving them with properties they couldn't develop as planned, and legal obligations they hadn't anticipated. After the hearing, Mrs. Rosa accepted congratulations from community representatives and park industry staff with gracious satisfaction that transcended personal vindication. Señor Minjae, Señora Simone, she embraced them with maternal warmth. Today we proved that communities can protect themselves when they understand their rights and find allies who care more about building than destroying. Mrs. Rosa, without your husband's foresight in preserving those documents, none of this would have been possible. Mijo, my husband always said that information is only valuable when shared with people who will use it wisely. Today, his papers found the right hands. 3 weeks after the court victory, Seoul Soul Food was packed with celebration that spilled onto Itaewon's sidewalks, where community members gathered to honor legal triumph that had preserved traditional districts citywide. Tables overflowed with dishes that represented Seoul's multicultural diversity. Korean banchan, alongside Mexican tamales, Filipino lumpia served next to American cornbread, fusion flavors that celebrated integration rather than assimilation. Minjae stood with Simone near the community kitchen where their relationship had begun, watching families share meals that tasted like victory and hope in equal measure. His recovered ability to taste made every flavor intense and meaningful. Salt, that reminded him of tears he'd finally learned to shed. Sweetness that came from accomplishments worth savoring. Complexity that required patience to appreciate fully. The board approved community partnership expansion to 12 traditional districts, he reported, reviewing municipal contracts that formalized park industry's commitment to cultural preservation development. Seoul's mayor wants our model replicated in other Asian cities facing similar heritage protection challenges. And Kim Development Group? Restructuring their acquisition strategy around heritage compliance requirements. Director Choi requested a meeting about potential collaboration on preservation-compatible projects. Simone laughed with satisfaction that came from watching adversaries become allies through legal necessity rather than moral conversion. Sometimes the best revenge is proving that your approach works better than theirs. Mrs. Rosa approached with ceremonial formality, carrying a wooden spoon that had belonged to her grandmother and represented culinary wisdom passed through generations of women who'd learned to feed communities through struggle and celebration alike. Simone mija, this spoon has stirred soup for 4 generations of our family. Today I pass it to you because you've learned the most important cooking lesson: how to season justice with love until it tastes like hope. The gift ceremony drew applause from 43 community members who understood that cultural transmission happened through objects that carried memory alongside practical utility. Simone accepted the spoon with reverence that honored both its history and its future, in hands that would continue feeding people who needed nourishment that transcended mere nutrition. Mrs. Rosa, I'll treasure this and the wisdom that comes with it. Use it well, mija. And remember, the best recipes combine tradition with innovation, just like the best communities. At 8 p.m., as the celebration wound down and families began cleaning dishes together with the easy cooperation that made communities work, Minjae and Simone walked toward Seoul Soul Food's kitchen for private conversation. Away from public attention, their relationship had finally learned to navigate successfully. Simone, there's something I need to ask you, and I need you to answer honestly. Always. 6 months ago, when this started, did you imagine it would lead to legal victory, corporate transformation, and us working together to preserve communities across Seoul? She considered the question, while seasoning a final pot of soup that would feed late-arriving celebration guests. Her movements automatic from years of practice, but mindful from months of understanding that cooking was political act as much as nutritional service. 6 months ago, I imagined fighting to preserve one neighborhood and hoping that falling in love wouldn't complicate community organizing beyond repair. Simone tasted her creation with the unconscious smile of satisfaction he'd learned to recognize as expression of pure professional pleasure. I never imagined that love would strengthen community organizing, or that community organizing would strengthen love. And now, what do you imagine for the future? Now, I imagine expanding community partnership development to every Seoul neighborhood that needs preserving, training other cities to implement similar models, and discovering whether people who fight together as successfully as we have can build something lasting when they're not in constant crisis mode. Min-jae moved closer, close enough to smell the lingering aromas of garlic and hope that always clung to her hair after cooking for communities she cared about. Simone Harrington, will you marry me? The proposal was unplanned and inevitable, arising from months of discovering that professional partnership and personal love could reinforce each other when both were based on shared values rather than individual ambition. Simone set down her spoon with movements that suggested time had slowed to accommodate decision-making that would shape years rather than moments. Min-jae Park, are you proposing because you love me? Or because you want to make sure your director of community relations doesn't get recruited by competing development firms? I'm proposing because I love you. Because working with you has made me better at both love and work. And because I want to spend whatever time we have left proving that some partnerships improve everything they touch. That's the most romantic thing anyone's ever said to me. Yes. They kissed with the salt taste of tears that came from joy rather than sorrow, surrounded by community kitchen aromas that would forever represent the place where business strategy became personal commitment, and personal commitment strengthened business strategy beyond what either could achieve alone. Min-jae, there's something I need to tell you about your mother's phone call yesterday. What kind of something? She wants to cater our wedding reception. Traditional Korean ceremony combined with Southern American celebration, fusion menu that honors both cultural traditions, guest list that includes every family we've helped preserve their neighborhoods. That sounds perfect and terrifying in equal measure. It sounds like family obligations that come with marrying into communities instead of just businesses. Outside, Seoul's evening air carried spring scents that promised summer growth. The city beautiful in ways that preservation had protected rather than development had eliminated. Traditional districts pulsed with authentic energy that would either be sustained through community partnership models or eventually consumed by aggressive development that prioritized extraction over investment. Simone, do you think we can actually change how development works in Seoul? Scale community partnership approaches until preservation becomes more profitable than demolition? I think we've already started changing how development works. One neighborhood at a time, one board meeting at a time, one legal victory at a time. She pulled him closer, her arms around his neck with intimacy that transcended corporate strategy while encompassing it. And Min-jae, I think some changes happen through people who fall in love with causes worth fighting for together, even when fighting requires sacrifice. Especially when fighting requires sacrifice. Because the things worth preserving, communities, cultures, relationships, only survive when people care enough to pay whatever price preservation requires. They stood in the community kitchen until midnight, holding each other against uncertainties that would always accompany work that mattered beyond quarterly earnings. Tomorrow would bring new neighborhoods needing preservation, new legal challenges requiring navigation, new competitors seeking to prove that efficiency trumped authenticity in Seoul's development market. But tonight tasted like victory that had been seasoned with love, until it satisfied hungers that profit margins could never fill. And Min-jae finally understood that recovering his ability to taste food had been less important than discovering appetite for life that could be shared with someone whose cooking fed communities, while her fighting preserved the places where communities could flourish. 1 year later, Min-jae stood in the kitchen of Seoul Soul Food's expanded location, wearing an apron that Simone had embroidered with Chief Tasting Officer in both English and Korean, learning to prepare their wedding feast with techniques that combined his mother's traditional recipes with flavors that represented communities they'd helped preserve across Seoul. The kimchi needs more time, Simone instructed, guiding his hands as he massaged salt into cabbage leaves with movements that had become natural through months of cooking together. Fermentation can't be rushed, no matter how impatient corporate executives get about quarterly results. Are you making culinary metaphors about business strategy? I'm making business metaphors about cooking wisdom. There's a difference. The wedding preparation had become a community event, with 47 families contributing dishes that told stories of neighborhoods preserved through adaptive reuse development, legal victories that established cultural heritage protection, and business models that proved community partnership could generate sustainable profits while preserving cultural authenticity. Mrs. Rosa supervised soup preparation with authority that made Park Industries board meetings seem simple by comparison, directing volunteers in techniques that honored Mexican culinary traditions while incorporating Korean ingredients available in Seoul's multicultural markets. "Miho," she called to Min-jae, "taste this caldo and tell me what it needs." Phew. He lifted the wooden spoon that had been passed from Simone's grandmother through generations of women who'd learned to feed communities through struggle and celebration, tasting complexity that his recovered palate could appreciate fully. Beef broth enriched with kimchi juice, cilantro brightened with perilla oil, fusion flavors that celebrated cultural mixing rather than assimilation. "It's perfect," he said honestly. "Rich, complex, comforting. Good. Now you understand why some recipes take time to develop properly. Marriage is like this soup. You cannot rush the ingredients into harmony. You must let them discover how to complement each other naturally." Park Miran entered the kitchen carrying containers of banchan that represented 3 generations of family recipes, her presence transforming chaotic wedding preparation into organized celebration that honored both Korean traditions and American customs that Simone had insisted on preserving. "Min-jae-ya, your father would be proud," she said, surveying community collaboration that had grown from business partnership into extended family relationships. He always believed successful companies should strengthen communities rather than just extract profit from them. "Yama, I wish he could see what we've accomplished. He can see. And more importantly, these families can see." Park Miran gestured toward volunteers who were chopping vegetables, seasoning soups, and sharing stories that connected neighborhood preservation to daily life improvements their children would inherit. "Your father's company is finally building something that lasts beyond quarterly earnings." The wedding ceremony took place at sunset on the rooftop of Park Industries building, Seoul's traditional districts visible below as neighborhoods that pulsed with authentic energy, protected through legal victories and community partnership development. 137 guests gathered to witness vows that formalized personal commitment while celebrating professional collaboration that had preserved cultural assets across 12 districts. "Simone," Min-jae said, as they exchanged rings that had been crafted by Insadong artisans, whose workshops the court victory had protected. "I promise to love you through corporate battles and community victories, through media attention and private moments, through whatever challenges come from building something meaningful together, rather than achieving success alone. Min-jae, I promise to cook with you, fight with you, and build communities with you, through board meetings and legal hearings, through successes that taste sweet, and failures that teach wisdom, through whatever adventures come from combining love with work that matters." Judge Park Sung-min, who had ruled in favor of cultural heritage protection 6 months earlier, officiated the ceremony with words that connected personal commitment to social responsibility in ways that made marriage feel like community celebration rather than private contract. Min-jae and Simone have demonstrated that love strengthens work when both are based on values worth defending together. May their partnership continue preserving communities while building relationship that inspires others to fight for causes larger than individual success. The reception feast represented culinary collaboration that honored Seoul's multicultural diversity. Korean bulgogi served alongside Mexican carnitas, Filipino pancit paired with American cornbread, Brazilian brigadeiros complemented by Korean rice cakes, fusion flavors that celebrated integration achieved through community partnership, rather than cultural assimilation imposed through development pressure. "Speech! Speech!" Voices called as dinner concluded and dancing began to music that mixed traditional Korean instruments with contemporary fusion that reflected neighborhoods preserved through adaptive reuse approaches. Min-jae stood with Simone beside the community kitchen that had been relocated to the rooftop for the celebration, addressing families whose homes had been preserved through legal victories that established cultural heritage protection as development requirement rather than development obstacle. "Ladies and gentlemen, families and friends," he began, his voice carrying over conversations that had grown quiet with attention. "1 year ago, I was a man who couldn't taste anything and owned everything. Tonight, I can taste every flavor in this incredible feast, And I own the most important thing anyone can possess: partnership with someone who makes work worth doing and life worth savoring. Applause rippled through the crowd. Min-jae continued, his words coming from places in his heart that had opened through community partnership and personal love that strengthened each other. This celebration honors more than one wedding. It celebrates communities that survived through collective action, legal protections that preserved cultural heritage, and business models that proved community partnership generates value that pure profit extraction cannot match. More applause. In the crowd, Min-jae spotted Mrs. Kim from his office, Director Kim from his board, and surprisingly, Director Choi, who had requested invitation to discuss collaborative approaches to cultural heritage compliance. But most importantly, tonight celebrates the possibility that people who care about each other can build something together that neither could achieve alone. Communities preserved through love, businesses strengthened through conscience, relationships deepened through shared missions that matter beyond individual comfort. The final applause was sustained and genuine. But Min-jae felt the weight of promises that would require years of sustained effort to fulfill completely. Marriage was beginning, not conclusion. Community partnership development would face ongoing challenges from competitors who prioritized efficiency over authenticity. Cultural heritage protection would need constant legal defense against development pressure that never stopped seeking profitable extraction opportunities. Later, as the celebration wound down and families began cleaning dishes together with cooperation that made communities function successfully, Min-jae and Simone stood on the rooftop edge, looking out over Seoul's traditional districts, where lights flickered in buildings that had been preserved through legal victories and community organizing that combined resistance with constructive alternatives. "So," Simone said, her wedding dress replaced by comfortable jeans and the apron that had become her signature uniform. "We won? We won the right to keep fighting for communities that need preserving," Min-jae replied, his formal suit exchanged for casual clothes that felt more authentic than corporate armor. "Now comes the real work, proving that love and business success aren't just compatible, but mutually reinforcing when both serve purposes larger than individual satisfaction." Together? Together. Because Simone, if we're going to change how development works in Seoul and beyond, we'll need to demonstrate that relationships strengthen work rather than complicate it, that caring about communities improves business decisions rather than compromises them. They kissed with salt taste of tears that came from gratitude rather than sorrow, surrounded by community kitchen aromas that would forever represent places where business strategy became personal commitment, and personal commitment strengthened business strategy in ways that served communities rather than just corporate profits. "Min-jae," she whispered against his lips. "What happens now? After the wedding, after the legal victories, after proving that community partnership works? Now we scale compassion without losing authenticity. Now we train other cities to implement preservation approaches that honor communities while generating sustainable returns. Now we discover whether people who fell in love fighting for neighborhoods can build relationship that lasts through whatever challenges come from succeeding at work that actually matters." Outside, Seoul's evening air carried summer scents that promised continued growth. The city beautiful in ways that preservation had protected while development had enhanced rather than eliminated. Traditional districts thrived with authentic energy that attracted tourists seeking cultural experiences they couldn't find elsewhere. Businesses that served communities rather than just extracting profit from them. Relationships that combined love with work in ways that strengthened both. "And if we're wrong?" Simone asked. "If scaling community partnership proves too expensive or legally complicated to sustain long-term, then we'll fail attempting something worth succeeding at, instead of succeeding at work that destroys what we care about." Min-jae pulled her closer, his hands framing her face with attention that had become habitual through months of discovering that some partnerships improved everything they touched. "But Simone, I don't think we're wrong. I think we've barely started building what's possible when people combine love with work that feeds communities rather than consuming them." They stood on the rooftop until dawn touched Seoul's skyline, holding each other against morning light that illuminated traditional districts, where families would wake up in homes preserved through community organizing, legal victories, and business models that proved some things were worth more than maximum profit margins. The restaurant industry would continue evolving, Development pressure would require ongoing resistance, and marriage would demand daily choice to love each other through whatever complications came from building something meaningful together, rather than achieving individual success in isolation. But sunrise tasted like possibility, seasoned with hope, and Min-jae finally understood that recovering his ability to taste food had been less important than discovering hunger for life that could be shared with someone whose cooking fed communities, while her fighting preserved places where communities could flourish for generations beyond quarterly earnings reports. Some appetites, it turned out, were best satisfied by learning to cook together.